Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Halton Local Plan hearing session. I'm Lynn Donnelly, the Programme Officer. Can I please remind you of the etiquette guide to keep your mic off until you're invited to speak and not to use the chat function. The inspectors will join shortly before 9:30. Can I ask you all to please mute your microphone and turn off your camera whilst other participants join? I will contact you just before the inspectors join. Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Hopkins and Mr. Hunter. If you could all turn your cameras on, please, but keep your mics muted. The inspectors will join shortly. Thank you. The inspectors have joined the meeting and will now take over. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome. It's 9:30 a.m. And it's time for me to open this hearing session on matter 12B and 16 relating to strategic residential allocation and greenbelt safeguarded land in North East Widnes. This marks the start of the Part 2 hearings looking at the detailed site allocations over the next 2 weeks, following the completion of the Part 1 hearings on strategic matters in March. My name is David Troy. I'm a Chartered Town Planner, and I've been been appointed jointly with Caroline Malloy, who is also a Chartered Town Planner, by the Secretary of State for Homes, Community and Local Government under Section 20 of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2004 as amended, to hold the examination into the soundness of the Halton Delivery and Allocations Local Plan, which I shall refer to from now on as the plan, and to produce a report of our conclusions and recommendations with regard to the soundness of the plan. Before we begin, can everyone hear and see me? Great. Okay, thank you. Could you just make sure everyone...
Sorry, I'm having trouble connecting through my normal computer at the moment. I'm on the phone instead.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Harper. Okay, we'll bear that in mind. Thank you. Okay, can everyone please ensure their mobile phones are switched off and are silent whilst the hearing's in session? Please can you ensure that your microphone is muted until you're invited to speak, so that we can avoid disturbance for any background noise and feedback from microphones on the computers. This session is being live streamed as well. It's been recorded by the council and will be published shortly via a link on the examination website for interested parties to view. Our role as inspectors to assess whether the plan satisfies the requirements of the 2004 Act, the relevant regulations, and whether it is sound. In order to be sound, the National Planning Policy Framework states that plans should be policy prepared, justified, effective and consistent with national policy. You would have met Lynn Donnelly. Lynn is the Programme Officer for the examination. Lynn works for us and independently from the council. She is responsible for administration arrangements outside the hearing sessions, and any contact will be made through Lynn. The hearing sessions, our examination guidance notes outline the procedure to be followed at the hearing sessions, the way in which written representations will be dealt with, and the availability of information. The way that we expect participants to behave during the hearing sessions is also set out for ease of reference from our virtual hearing etiquette guidance, which has been set out to all participants along with their invitation. The hearing session is programmed to all day and will finish no later than 3:30 p.m. However, there may be some flexibility on that, and we'll need to take breaks during the day to allow sufficient time for screen breaks. Miss Harper, is it possible just to mute your actual phone? I know you're having trouble, but is it possible just to mute your phone, because we can hear the background noise at the moment, if that's possible? Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much. The hearing sessions will take the form of a structured discussion, which I shall lead, following the previously circulated agenda, which is based on the matters, issues and questions paper already circulated. We shall invite people to speak at a particular time, but if you have something to contribute to the appropriate part of the discussion, please indicate you wish to speak by raising the raised hand function on Teams, or Mr. Harper, if you just raise your hand, we'll bring you in at the moment. We ask that you keep your camera switched on for the entire session, if possible, but with your microphone muted until you're invited to speak. The only exception to this is where there's more than one participant per representative. In these cases, we ask that you only one participant has the camera turned on at any one time. There may be some questions on which we have enough information, and so there may be little or no discussion on these. We'd also like to remind participants that you've been provided all your evidence in your original representations and hearing statements, and the hearing sessions are not an opportunity to submit for anything further. Any comments you make during this hearing session shall therefore relate to the points made in your original representations. We've read your original representations and hearing planning statements, so there's no need to repeat what you've already said. The purpose of this session is for us to seek clarification and further information on any outstanding questions we may have. Does anybody have any questions at this stage?
Yes. Well, I'd just have some clarification really regarding the context of this session 12B, because if I can just expand on that. In the
is it to do the action points? Just because is it to do the action points from the previous sessions? Because I was going to quickly ask the council to ask for an update. So it might be useful to get the update first, and then it might be useful to give you in that context, if that's okay. Really, the questions I was asking there was really procedural. If there's any procedural issues, rather than interjecting into other matters that have been raised previously. So if I could just firstly ask if there's no procedural or legal issues to raise at this stage, I just wanted to ask participants if they could just introduce themselves today, starting with the council if I could, and then I'll move on to other participants.
Thank you, sir. My name is Alistair Cross. I'm a principal planner in the local plans team for the council.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. My name is John Hunter, and I am the barrister instructed to represent the council. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, sir. My name's Catherine Brindley. I'm the Principal Planning Officer within the Planning Policy team at the Council.
Thank you.
Good morning, sir. My name is Anne Moyers. I work in the policy team at St Helens Council.
Okay.
Good morning, sir. I'm Phil Peake. I work in the highway development side at Halton Borough Council.
Morning, sir. Tim Gibbs. I'm the Director for Planning and Highways and Transport at Halton.
Morning, sir. Andrew Plant. I'm the Divisional Manager for Planning and Development at the Council, and that's all from the Council's team.
Okay, thank you. If you could just start with the participants, starting with Mr. Harper then, please.
Thank you very much. It's Phil Harper. I'm just representing Colleen, who's here.
Morning.
Who's representing essentially residents in North Widnes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Mr. Mark Saunders.
Good morning, sir. My name is Mark Saunders. I'm a Director of NJL Consulting. We are agents for Miller Homes.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Coxon.
Good morning, sir. Yes, John Coxon, Emery Planning. I'm here on behalf of Holland Strategic Land, and their site interest is site W11.
Thank you. Mr. Gilbert.
Morning, sir. Ian Gilbert here from Barton Wilmore on behalf of Red Row Homes. And we have land interests at site W9 and part of W11.
Okay, Mr. Hopkins, please.
Good morning, sir. Mike Hopkins. I'm a director at JLL. We're acting on behalf of Notcutts in respect of Riddendale Garden Centre and the safeguarded land adjacent to it.
Okay, thank you. Is that all participants? Thank you. Okay, initially, if I could just ask, just obviously as a bit of context really, just if I could ask for an update from the council on the, and for the benefit of our other participants on the, just a quick update on the various action points from the previous part 1 hearings. There was a number of action points raised, particularly in relation to the housing requirements matter 4 and the green belt matter 8, please.
Yes, apologies, sir. Obviously, we had hoped to get that material to you before now, but unfortunately, computer gremlins and a rather epic election have sort of got in the way. We hope to get the figures to you within the next couple of days. In terms of the updated figures, the jobs growth figures for the D6 site, obviously the latest matters statement from the participant there does provide indication of the build timetable and the jobs associated with each phase, but they haven't actually collated it into jobs by year. We're collating that, and we will go back to them and ask them to clarify that is their understanding, and then hopefully we'll be able to submit that within the next couple of days to you. And then we basically the other pieces of jigsaw should all fall into place, and we'll be able to update the other information that we said that we would, including the exceptional circumstances table. We'll be able to slot the numbers in there and give you the latest position.
Okay, that's fine. But yeah, basically those will be submitted, basically made available basically in the next few days. I know matter 17, the hearing statement you've submitted obviously covers a number of those matters. I'm just going to bring Miss Malloy in to just give you basically a bit of just an update really, just in relation how this will feed in the whole discussion on the site allocations over the next few days, over the next 2 weeks, how that will feed into our consideration of the housing land supply when we come to that in June. So I'll just hand over briefly and then.
Thank you, Mr. Troy. Yeah, there are a couple of other action points which I think would be worth updating participants on and ourselves before we get into the housing land supply discussion. We have received a draft statement of common ground from the yourselves and the HSC, but obviously it's not quite there yet. Can Mr. Cross just update us on where that is and whether we'll be getting any? I think what would be useful in that statement of common ground is to have a list of sites where there is not agreement. It's sort of couched in quite broad terms. Can you just give us an update on that, please, Mr. Cross?
Mr. Gibbs is leading on that, so if Mr. Gibbs could provide the update.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, discussions with the HSE continue. The most recent correspondence was a reply. I'm not sure whether you've had that through from the programme officer, but the HSE declined to comment on the statement of common ground because they were wanting to know the status of CS23, which is the planning for risk policy that's not before the examination. So I referred them to your response from December, which was basically saying that policy wasn't on the table. So I'm waiting for a reply to that. But I think your idea is a good one, Marm, in that we can provide you with a list of sites where we don't think there will be any issue with the compatibility of other development types. Because what the HSE's representations don't really do is is object to certain sites. They're basically just highlighting that there's an encroachment of the zones, but they don't go into the detail of whether or not development would be suitable. So using their representations, we can provide a list of sites where we think that development is suitable on those sites, if that would be of assistance.
It would, thank you. And I think conversely, a list of sites where it may not be suitable for that particular use. Sort of if it's a higher risk use, for example, because I think it sort of quite pivotal to the discussion in terms of the deliverability of sites. The other point which we require an update on, which again will feed into the discussion on the deliverability of sites, is the open space study and playing pitch strategy. There are obviously quite a number of sites which are designated as a green space designation in a former plan, and obviously we would need the evidence that those sites are surplus to requirements and no longer needed. So if we could just have an update on that, that would be useful. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. I was checking with our colleagues over the weekend to see where the report is up to. We are in receipt of what we believe is the final version of the report. It's going to the steering group for final sign-off. I'm just double-checking with the lead officer that we can submit that to you this afternoon, the open space strategy. In terms of the open space figures for the updates, we will provide that at the same time, so that should be able to be with you tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. And just be prepared for discussion on sites where there is an existing designation, that we would be looking for that evidence in terms of whether that site would be surplus to requirements, just to put you on warning of that. Okay, I think that's what I wanted to cover in terms of the action points. Just to say a few words before we get into discussion on individual sites, just in terms of how we're going to approach the housing land supply matter discussion later on in the hearings. What we're going to try to do for each allocated site, at the end of the discussion on that particular site, we're hoping to get an agreed position in terms of the deliverability, the start date, and the annual output of development on each particular site at the end of each session within stage 2. And we've asked the council to keep a kind of a table with each site showing the annual output where that can be agreed, and that will inform the discussion on matter 17 later on. And in theory, if we can get an agreed position within these sessions on each site, the discussion on matter 17 should be relatively straightforward. It doesn't always work out that way in reality. But also what I was going to ask the council to do, preempting the fact we may not get agreement on each site, is keep a parallel table with the developer's position where we can't reach agreement. So we have the council's position, we have the developer's position, but hopefully we'll be able to reach discussion in terms of the output of sites as we go through. But if not, if the council could keep the annual, the parallel table, that would be really useful. Is that something that Mr. Cross's team can do? Sorry to add to your burden again, but.
Yes, ma'am. I just had a question regarding that. Are you wanting the table purely to cover the proposed allocation site, rather than the full list of SLA sites in the Matter 17 table, which is somewhat expansive?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I've sort of tried to wade through that over the weekend. I'm a bit cross-eyed trying to decipher it. But I think it would be useful to have an agreed position on each site, and maybe that's kept as a separate table. But obviously, we're going to need to have an agreed position in terms of the housing land supply, or a position on housing land supply. And I was also going to ask you that obviously the table is quite tricky just because of the number of sites, but to actually pull out the sites which will contribute, in your view, to the 5-year housing land supply. I think that would be really useful for ourselves and other participants. So if that's something your technical wizards could do, that would be fantastic.
We're happy to commit to try. Unfortunately, that was the table that was having the technical gremlins. The file kept corrupting. So that there might have been some choice language at this end of the call a week ago. But yes, that's something we can do. That's not a problem at all. We can do that, and we should be able to provide a copy for, I say, the latest version to the programme officer, who could possibly circulate it for before each day's session, if that's.
I think that would be useful, and as I say, hopefully, if we can keep those tables up to date as we go through each session, hopefully it'll make Matter 17 relatively straightforward. So I think that was probably it before we get into the site-based discussion, unless anyone's got any queries in terms of the proposed approach. Yes, Mr. Harper.
Sorry, the point I was going to make was that during Matter 8, which we held on 16th of March, Mr. Cross identified a revised requirement for Greenbelt based on actual delivery, because Windfalls are delivering something like 80% of the housing supply in the first 6 years of the DALP. And that revised figure was 600 dwellings for the whole of Halton to be met from Greenbelt land, 1,000 from the Widnes housing market, and minus 400 from Runcorn. Now, obviously, that has a major impact in terms of the allocation of SRL 7, for example, in that is the requirement now 1,000 rather than 2,168 from Widnes, which is what currently is in the DALP, or are we still sticking to the original Greenbelt exceptional circumstances requiring those elements of land to be removed?
Mr. Cross, did you want to come back on that? I mean, obviously, it's something we'll discuss in Matter 17 in terms of the sort of broad requirement versus supply. Any particular points, Mr. Cross, you wanted to come back on?
I say we set out the figures in our paper to Matter 17, as we just covered. I say we will update the exceptional circumstances paper table. We'll try and get that to the examination as soon as practicable. Obviously, there is a little bit chicken and egg. I say the figures are based on the proposed policy figure of 350 per annum, which obviously you are dealing with and may come to an alternate conclusion. Obviously, pending the figures from the D6 site, actual justification. So it's a little bit all up in the air at the moment. But
sorry to interrupt, Mr. Cross. You just broke up a little bit there. If you could just repeat the last couple of sentences. Sorry.
I was just saying, obviously, as we mentioned at the beginning of the session, we are just chasing the confirmation of the jobs generation rate on the Daresbury SciTech site, which I believe will inform your consideration as to the appropriateness or otherwise of the 350 dwellings per annum figure as currently contained in the plan. So obviously, if you're minded to change that figure, then that will have a knock-on effect for the balance of supply and demand and the eventual picture. But as I say, we will update the table and the exceptional circumstances paper and get that to you ASAP.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cross. Mr. Harper.
Sorry, I don't think that answered the question as to if Mr. Cross identified a requirement of 1,000 homes from Greenbelt land in Matter 8, and we currently have 2,168 homes from Greenbelt in the DALP. Is it relevant or not relevant to this session we're having today?
Mr. Cross?
I'm not sure there's much I can add to what's set out in Matter 17. Our understanding of today was we were looking at the suitability and deliverability of individual sites as to whether or not they are actually required to meet an identified shortfall we believed would be dealt with in Matter 17 in week 5.
Mr. Harper, I agree with that. I think the basis for the discussions within stage 2 is to discuss the appropriateness of individual site allocations. Matter 17 will look at the overall housing land supply position. Obviously, Mr. Troy and myself will be considering the appropriateness, so otherwise, of the housing land requirement, and then it will all come together, hopefully. So possibly preempting our consideration of future matters, but certainly I think the updated exceptional circumstances tables will give you a clear picture of where things are at, an up-to-date position of where things are at. So hopefully that answers your question without preempting the outcome of our report.
Okay.
Okay,
thank you very much for clarification. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Okay, if there aren't any other queries, I shall hand over Mr. Troy to discuss the SRL 7 site. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So yes, today basically we're going to be talking an issue about SRL7, the detail, basically using the matter issues and questions basic as a basis for the questions we're going through, plus matters that have been picked up really through the statements that have been submitted and representations on the site, and then we'll move as the agenda says on to the safeguarded land at SG12. So I'm just going to, if we just ask the council, just looking basically at the agenda really, starting with the background to the allocations and the options considered. Basically, if basically in relation to the sites in North East Widnes, if the council could just provide a background to the site allocations, how they're identified and what options were considered.
Thank you, sir. As you're probably well aware, now I believe you visited this last week. The borough is we are a comparatively small borough, tightly constrained boundaries. With neighbouring authorities and neighbouring settlements located very close on most of the boundaries, particularly in the northern half of the borough around Widnes. The council concluded, say in the exceptional circumstances paper, that there was exceptional circumstances that warranted going into the green belt. I say that was the conclusion of the previous delivery and allocation, the previous core strategy examination, which committed the council to doing a green belt review. There's very few options where we can go. We aren't a large authority. We don't really have the option of creating new settlements. So obviously the main option for us is effectively the outward expansion of the existing settlements. And in Widnes, it's effectively we either head north and fill in some of the sites in North Widnes, or we go south, basically at Hale Bank, which I believe will be the topic of tomorrow's discussions. We undertook a Greenbelt review looking at the importance of the contribution that each of the current Greenbelt sites made to the Greenbelt. And we looked at the sustainability of the sites and looked at any prohibitive constraints. Effectively, the sites that were chosen, as has been mentioned previously, one of the initial version of the plan that was put to members showed the entirety of the land at the back of Lunts Heath Road to the eastern to the Watkinson Way bypass was originally recommended for removal from the green belt and allocating for residential purposes. Unfortunately, the members didn't feel able to support that option and effectively asked and told us to go away. So the previous version of the plan, the housing on that area was struck out, and there was significantly more housing proposed in the Hale Bank area, which whenever we discuss tomorrow, you'll see that some of the areas, particularly south of where we are now proposing, are a bit more problematic in terms of supporting habitat for the Ramsar site, etc. The latest version of the plan, certain of the sites have basically been carried forward. In northeast Widnes, W9, 10 and 11 have been carried forward through each of the iterations of the plan as proposed by Greenbelt releases and allocation for housing. W49, I say members originally struck out housing in that area. They did feel able to support a smaller allocation within that area, and that's now W40, W49. We'd had originally with the previous version of the plan, which was proposing a higher housing figure, we did have a couple of sites also in the mix of for allocation, so SG10 and SG12. And I say basically with the lower housing number, the councils felt that we don't actually require those sites at this time, and so the council is basically recommending that those are allocated as safeguarded sites, which may or may not be required, and if they are at some future point, and if they are, that will be dealt with through a future review of the local plan.
Okay, thank you. You just say Hale Bank, we are discussing on Wednesday, not tomorrow. Just a point of clarification for anyone watching. It's northwest Widnes, so we'll speak tomorrow, discuss tomorrow. So, yeah, has any of the participants got any comments just at this stage on the background? We will cover Greenbelt issues shortly. Okay, I'm just going to move on to the planning history status aside. I just wanted to get a basic up-to-date position really for just basically each of the actual sites, the parcels of land that have been submitted in northeast Widnes, if I could. If we could just start with W9, the land at Mill Green Farm, if I could just confirm what the planning status history of that in terms of sites, and then just if we could get the developers just view on that as well, please.
Thank you. Yes, the site is currently allocated as Greenbelt. I don't think there's been any substantive applications affecting that site to date.
Okay, thank you. And the developer's view, I think, is it Mr. Coxon, is it?
I think it's Mr. Gilbert.
Mr. Gilbert. You're looking for me, sir.
Yeah.
No, I share that understanding, sir.
Thank you. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Mr. Gilbert. You just confirm the status. Is that right? Is that correct?
Yeah, sorry, sir. I seem to be having trouble unmuting. Yeah, that's correct, sir.
Okay, fine. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, if we just move on to W10, which is the land at effectively South Lane. There's a block of land basically sandwiched in between around South Lane, just north of South Lane.
Yeah, this is a funny site. It sort of looks in sort of quasi sort of commercial use, but there is actually a resident on the site. I think it has had previous applications. So he wants to basically build a house. And with basically been quite aggrieved with it being in the Greenbelt and being unsuccessful to get housing on there. Perhaps Mr. Plant might have some additional detail just in terms of the background if you require it.
Mr. Plant, have you got anything further to add?
Sir, that's correct. In 2011, there was 2010 there was an application for a two-storey dwelling that was withdrawn, and in 2011 there was a refusal for one dwelling.
Okay. Okay, anything from the developers from that perspective? I don't think there's anyone specifically representing that site. Okay, if we just move on to W11, yeah, it's the land boundary farm, Abbey Farm, and South Lane, land of South Lane. So again, the council just update me on that. status?
Again, the site boundaries drawn with quite encompasses a number of land holdings. The main ownership has there's a house in the sort of towards the middle of the site, down close to the back of the Red Rose scheme. I think that's had some various planning applications, I think, for conversion of buildings and the creation of some additional residential. But there certainly hasn't been anything covering the substantive site. So there's been small infill residential applications, but I say nothing substantive.
Okay. Okay, I think Mr. Coxon and Mr. Gilbert, I think, on this one. So just see if you could just give me your views, just in relation to just the status as you understand.
Thank you, sir. No, I think there's nothing substantive in terms of the development of the site that would be relevant to this allocation. Just to note, though, that the land to the southwest was an allocation in the previous adopted development plan.
Okay.
Nothing further from me, sir.
Okay, great. Okay, if you just go on to W40, the Watkinson Way Loop, the small land area of land, basically, if you just give me an update where we are with that one, please.
Yep, thank you, sir. That site, as I say, is a brownfield site. It wasn't, and it wasn't formerly in the green belt, so it's not currently a green belt site. It has the latest permission on there, or the latest application is it's got a resolution to approve, subject to, I believe, assigning of section 106 for 42 apartment units. And that application was a 2020 application, an outline. We do have the reference number if you would like it.
Yes, if you just give it to me, that'd be great. Thank you.
It's 20/00026/OUT.
Okay, thank you. And at this stage, it's basically got permission subject to a resolution for a section 106. Is that the current status? There isn't anything further at this stage.
Correct.
No, okay, great. And I think there's any. I think is that a council-owned site? I think we go on to.
No, it's a privately owned site, I believe.
Right, okay, thank you. Right, anything from the developers on that? Okay, if we just move on to the land at W49 then, please, if we could. So it's Lund Heath Road, East.
Again, it's currently a greenbelt site. There haven't been any substantive applications covering the site.
Okay. Mr. Saunders, I understand you are representing Ms. Holmes on this site.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Sorry I didn't make that clear at the outset. Nothing further to add to what Mr. Cross has said.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Okay, thank you. Let's give me an update where we are those sites. Thank you very much. Just moving on to the Greenbelt review, the conclusions of that, and obviously the effect on the individual parcels of land. If we could just again get the council in relation to each site, starting with W9, the land at Millgrain Farm. Please could the council just state what the findings of the Greenbelt review were, specifically in terms of the land in question. What contribution does it make in terms of its purpose of including land witin the Greenbelt in its current form? What would be the effect of the proposed the purpose of the Greenbelt, including the land within the Greenbelt? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Again, the Greenbelt findings are set out in the Greenbelt study, but they're also summarised in the individual site assessment sheets, which are appended to our Matter 12 statement. For W9, overall the site was assessed as having a moderate contribution towards including land within the Greenbelt.
in relation to W9. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes.
And could I just outline just what the purposes were that basically in terms of the discussion regarding the purposes, the 5 purposes of the green, but how that would affect those matters just briefly.
Yeah, sorry, sir. Sorry, I thought I was on mute for a second, sorry. Yes, I say the Greenbelt study, I looked at the 5 purposes, including land within the Greenbelt. 2 of the purposes weren't specifically assessed at site-specific level. In terms of the historic settlements, Alton doesn't contain historic settlements. And in terms of regeneration, because any Greenbelt site would contribute towards the regeneration equally. But in terms of the assessment of this site, effectively it is abutted by the urban area on 2 sides. It is with the Notcutts Garden Centre and the development along Mill Lane. Basically the development of this site wouldn't create a projection into the Greenbelt, so in some ways it actually contributes towards the rounding off of the settlement. The site doesn't have any particular, particular value. Whilst it is in countryside use, is probably the main issue that was raised as being a positive Greenbelt function.
Okay, fine. If I could just ask the developers just to come in basically on that, Mr. Gilbert, in terms of W9, if you could. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. You'll see from our representations, we broadly agree with the council's assessment methodology. I think the only other thing that we raise is how, whilst the Greenbelt parcel forms a partial contribution or overall, which the conclusion needs to be moderate, the council needs to be moderate. We talk about how that is a low scoring Greenbelt parcel in terms of the overall context of the borough. So.
Okay. Mr. Harper, I think you had a contribution.
Thank you very much. I'm on the main computer now, having rebooted.
Great.
Updated and everything else that went on.
Thank you.
As far as I understand it, the Mill Lane's assessment said that it wasn't a rounding. It would create a bulge projecting beyond the existing boundary. So I understand it to say it wasn't a rounding, it was actually a bulge. And when we should point out that when we're talking about gaps, sort of government guidelines says several miles, and we're talking about in Mill Lane terms 1.9 kilometres. So it has an effect.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cross, do you want to come back on that point, please?
Yes, in terms of the gap, I think we dealt with this previously. Yes, the government guidance says that the Greenbelt boundaries Greenbelt should be several miles wide. That's rarely the case within the Liverpool City region. There's a lot of very narrow gaps and pinch points. In terms of the situation in Halton, the site here, the width of the Greenbelt, this is probably one of the widest areas of Greenbelt within North Widnes. Whilst yes, I fully accept that it's not what it would be expected elsewhere, but say given the very constrained urban nature of the area, it is one of the widest Greenbelt areas.
Okay. Mr. Gilbert.
Thank you, sir. Just in response, to add to what Mr. Cross said in response to Mr. Harper, we've been through the reasons why north of Widnes is an appropriate location for growth in other matters, and it's not necessary to repeat that here, sir. But if you go to the council's submission EL003A, which is their parcelling map and summary maps, you'll see that we agree that well, we haven't disputed the council's assessment methodology in terms of what is and what isn't rounding off. But in terms of the gap to other settlements, you'll see that the W9, site W9, is one of the best performing sites in terms of the gap to other settlements. So it's quite clear to see graphically there when you look at the north of Widnes.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Harper, have you?
Sorry, I was just going back on the question. As Mr. Cross did say, it was a rounding, but it's not rounding. It's a bulge projecting into beyond the existing boundary, was what was found in the Greenbelt review.
Okay, thank you. I think I've got that. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm just going to move on to just in terms of the Greenbelt conclusions review. Again, similar question really, relation to W10, the small parcel land just to the effectively between South Lane. Again, if I could just ask for the council's basically the findings of the Greenbelt review into this relation to this bit of land, its current form, and what effect the proposed housing allocation would have on the purposes of including this land within the Greenbelt. So in relation to W10.
Thank you. The summary of conclusions was a moderate contribution to Greenbelt purposes. It concluded that the site is slightly detached from the urban area. It doesn't have a hard boundary, just the southwestern corner abuts the current built-up area. However, obviously, if depending on W11, here come W11, W9, then it would basically share a boundary on two sides with the urban area. The site is quite heavily wooded, the boundaries, so it's quite difficult to see into the site. I say it's not, I believe, in a countryside use, and as just mentioned, it is sitting in one of the larger, although admittedly small, gaps to adjacent settlements.
Okay, thank you. Any other contributions on that W10? Okay, if I just move on to W11 then, please. Boundary Farm and Abbey Farm, South Lane, please. Same information really from the council initially, please.
Sorry, I'm just scrolling to look at the group site rather than the individual sites. Obviously,
if you could just also, because obviously I'm quite interested in the individual, just if you can. I know the groups give an overall score, but it's just individual. Just if you could just literally.
Okay. Obviously, as discussed, the process that we undertook with the Greenbelt review was initially to parcel land that appeared to be in similar use and potentially similar ownership. I think this is one of the sites where you will see in the report, I think it's also included as split sites, and that was following representations on the consultation on the Greenbelt study from the individual landowners who wanted their sites segregating down and assessing separately. But if we go through the sites, I say in terms of which are appended to our Matter 12 statement, we've got site 167 as moderate contribution towards the Greenbelt. We have the sort of southern portion of the site, which is in the residential use, or partially in the residential use, that is determined as. That's a moderate contribution to the Greenbelt. Again, that site is abutting the urban area to its western boundary. It's the new Red Row, Barrows Green Lane development with the railway line to the south. We then have. Is that that's the only ones we've got there. Sorry, I'm just scrolling through. The joys of not working in the office, we're not surrounded by paper. Yep, sorry, the site north of the Red Road development, which is shown as the site 166, And again, that is identified as having a partial contribution to the greenbelt purposes. I say over the site, I say areas of the site are in agricultural use. I say sections of the site are in residential, the wider site are in residential use. Obviously, the parcels towards the western side of the site do abut to the built-up area, the settlement boundary, and therefore are assessed as basically not being separate. So that they have less greenbelt function in terms of encroachment from the urban area.
Okay.
So the overall conclusions are a bit of a mix. To say the further out you go, the stronger the greenbelt function was assessed.
Yeah, thank you. Right, if we just bring in Mr. Gilbert first, and then Mr. Coxon.
Thank you, sir. I didn't want to labour the point on on W9, but just to be clear, we whilst we support the council's assessment, I do take issue with Mr. Harper's comments that this is a bulge into the greenbelt. That's whilst we're not arguing there's a rounding off. You'll see on site, sir, that the Mill Green Farm site W9 has got is no further north than other development in that location, and you've got the Notcutts Rivendell commercial centre to the north. So I do dispute that it's a bulge there. On W9, we agree with the council's
W11, is it, Mr. Gilbert?
Sorry, sir. W11. We do agree with the council's assessment and obviously supportive of the whole of the allocation coming forward. The only thing I'd point out, sir, is that our site at Barrows Green Lane is the westernmost proportion of that proposed allocation, and that's assessed under a site 045, and that's the worst performing greenbelt parcel in that allocation. So being surrounded by on all sides.
Okay, Mr. Coxon, if I just get you just to come in on W11, please.
Thank you, sir. I thought I made, just as a point of clarification of my position, Mr. Harper raised a point about greenbelt and the extent of greenbelt and being several miles wide. I'm not sure what national policy was being referred to, whether that was I'm certainly aware there was a very historic circular which referred to this, but I think that would be a reference to the overall extent of a greenbelt rather than some kind of guidance on individual settlements and the gaps that should be maintained. So I thought I'd just clarify that point, sir. In terms of site W11, I think the council's absolutely correct. We agree that the grouped assessment is the one to look at because that's the one that reflects effectively how the site is contained on the ground and the proposal in the plan. The group site does make a moderate contribution, and as we've heard, there are very few sites across the whole of Halton which make a lower contribution as grouped parcels than moderate, and obviously there's only one grouped site in Widnes that makes a lower contribution. I would just point out, sir, that we've argued in our representations that actually it could be the case that the site arguably makes a lesser contribution to the greenbelt, so a partial contribution. And in that regard, so just point to the fact that, as I say, the site is extremely well contained, both in terms of physical boundaries. So you've got South Lane and the railway, and also in terms of visual containment, which obviously the PPG talks about as a factor. And there are also urbanising features present within the site, so electricity pylons and residential properties. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Harper?
Sorry to just labour this bulge question. It wasn't my idea. I just reported what it said in the Greenbelt assessment. I was just pointing out it didn't say rounding. It actually said it was a bulge, but that's not my view. That was the view of the actual Greenbelt assessment.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Just keeping with W11, just one of the points I wanted just to raise in relation to the Greenbelt review, identified a small parcel land GB048 to the south of South Lane on the site W11 as making a significant contribution to the purposes of safeguarding countryside from encroachment. Is it justified to include this land? As far as I understand from looking at the Greenbelt review, it's this small bit of land near to the railway bridge, abutting South Lane and sandwiched between the railway line. Is it justified in terms of its assessment, and is it justified to include this land? Should the boundary be changed to remove this area? Mr. Cross.
Yes, to say the assessment did show that that area was a significant contribution, effectively because it is looked at individually. It is detached from the urban area. It is in countryside use, but you can see that there are residential properties along the northern edge, existing residential properties along the northern edge, and should the land immediately to the west be released for development, then the assessment for that individual site would obviously change in terms of its not being detached from the urban area. It would then be encroached, and as mentioned, I say there are urban features that do impact on that site. The boundaries there's not particularly, I think, strong boundaries from memory between the parcels there. So in terms of creating a hard Greenbelt boundary, we don't think it warrants the retention of this single parcel, comprising of two individual fields, from retaining that in the Greenbelt at this time.
Okay, and what impacts, basically, how do you think the impact of the development on this piece of parcel, obviously that's got a significant contribution, how would the impact on this area be addressed as part of the overall development of site W11? Have the council got a view on that?
Sorry, could you rephrase that? I wasn't sure.
How would the impact? I suppose what I'm trying to see is, obviously you've got a parcel of land, obviously that's of the furthest sort of eastern part of parcel land. How the impact of that parcel land, the development of the area, how would it be addressed to ensure that you consider, obviously, the evidence that you've indicated that, obviously, in terms of your Greenbelt view, that shows it's got a significant contribution. How would the actual development of the area be? How would you address that as part of your overall development? In terms of boundary treatment, for instance?
As I say, the site at the moment, it's got the railway line, which is on a slight embankment, because obviously you can see that it goes over Warrington Road at that point. So the site is sort of like well screened to the south. The site is sections of the along Warrington Road, or South Plain Derby Road are well vegetated. So the site is, in the area is quite well screened. I say in terms of the overall assessment, Greenbelt assessment, if the adjacent sites were to be developed for residential, then say the assessment would be unlikely to conclude that it made a significant contribution.
So, for instance, obviously the railway boundary obviously is one boundary. Obviously, South Lane runs along effectively the northern boundary of that particular site. Would additional landscaping be provided, for instance, to reinforce? Would that be a way in which you'd obviously look to reinforce the boundary on that parcel of land to ensure you create a strong Greenbelt boundary? That's what I'm trying to ascertain, really, how you consider that particular point.
Well, obviously the presence of the road is a fixed physical barrier, which would basically create a strong defensible greenbelt boundary at that location. I know there has been some discussions regarding the wider site and effectively looking at the possibility of putting improved cycleway facilities along the south side of the road, which would basically probably involve some amendments to the boundary treatments along the wider area and stretching into this end parcel, parcel GB48.
Okay, Mr. Coxon, do you want to come in, please?
Yes, thank you, sir. Very briefly, I would just on that question, just obviously refer back to my previous comments in relation to the group site is the correct one to look at. And in that regard, I would just refer you to paragraph 139F of the framework, which obviously talks about when defining greenbelt boundaries that they should be defined clearly using physical features that are readily recognisable and likely to be permanent. And that is, of course, in this location, the railway and South Lane. Certainly, so in terms of landscaping and so on, our client certainly envisions that there will be additional landscaping and a detailed landscaping scheme looking at that boundary in particular, albeit I would just, as you'll have seen on site, sir, noted that the site is actually very well screened already and very well contained on that eastern side. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Coxon. Okay, if there's no other contributions on W11, if I could just move on to W49, which is the Greenbelt site. Again, if you just counter me an overview, basically the findings of the review in terms of its contribution to the purposes of the Greenbelt and its current form, and then the effect of the proposed housing allocation as proposed on that land, please. Mr. Cross, yeah.
Thank you, sir. Yep. Sorry, I'm just scrolling down. Again, the site was assessed as a number of parcels. It was also there was a group site covering the wider potential allocation, which obviously the members did not support. If you start at the eastern end of the site, the three main parcels at the eastern end of the site were assessed as having a partial contribution towards purposes of the Greenbelt. The more developed, there was a parcel just behind some of the development, which was assessed as having a limited contribution, and the part of the site in the northernmost parcel was assessed as having a moderate contribution to the purposes of including land within the Greenbelt, which again will be down to probably the difference. The key difference is the whether or not the degree of encroachment, so the degree of a shared boundary with the existing urban edge.
Okay. Ms. Saunders, do you wish to come in on this particular parcel land, please?
Thank you, sir. I think the council's approach is supported. We don't raise much about the conclusions of the individual parcels that Mr. Cross has referenced. I think maybe in contrary to the way in which the other W11 perhaps is looked at, we believe it's more appropriate for you to take a view of each parcel here, because if you look at the individual assessments, which are GB051, GB053, 059 and 060, over 80% of the site area is within overall function conclusions, which is either limited or partial. So I think in terms of setting the appropriate base position for you to consider future impact, that's the most appropriate way to look at this site. To assist, we've supplemented our 2019 representations with further landscape and visual work as well, and it's appended to our representations from March in Appendix 2, prepared by Pegasus, and that looks at the landscape and visual impact and receptors to consider impact on openness, but also takes a view of how the individual greenbelt functions are impacted as a result of development on the site. I guess part of the equation is mitigation, as you just rightly saying, in relation to the other parts of land in the strategic allocation. Just a further point to note on boundary treatments and reinforcements. The western parcel or portion of the allocated site does score as a limited contribution, that's closest to Luntheath Road, but to its north there's that parcel of land, I think it's GB060, which is an east-west field. And obviously the development, as you'll see from our indicative master plan at appendix 4 of our representations, will create a north-south boundary. Now, obviously that's going to be something that's going to be subject to development management with the council, but that portion of the field does score as limited, even though the boundary itself is seen as being weak. So we feel that we can appropriately mitigate through that north-south boundary reinforcement for the allocation once it's brought forward. Thanks, sir.
Okay, thank you. So any other contributions on W49 in relation to the Greenbelt findings? No. Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to move on to the just in relation to the sites. Basically, just to ascertain whether the council, if looking at each site, whether there's recognisable, hard, defensible greenbelt boundaries. I know we've touched on it in relation to discussions in relation to W11, but and in part. But I just wanted to, if you just could go through each of the sites again, starting with W9. If you just go through those, please. Basically, W9, W10, W11, then W49. If you just go through those, just in terms of that question, please.
Thank you, sir. Yes, W9 is surrounded on all sides, or the proposed release is surrounded on all sides by existing roads. Obviously, there are a couple of residential properties which are shown as proposed primarily residential rather than part of the allocation, but the area of land proposed to be removed from the greenbelt is delineated by roads on all sides. Similarly, W40, there is a road that forms the northern boundary, and the southern boundaries has roads on all three sides. W11, again, it's South Lane, forms a hard boundary. W49, the northern boundary, is Watkinson Way, the Widnes eastern bypass. As just mentioned, the sort of the north-western boundary there is not well defined, but to say I'm sure that through the site, the design of the site, then a strong boundary could be created at that point.
Okay, thank you. Just put that question to the developers in terms of starting maybe with W9 and then going through again.
Yeah, thank you, sir. On W9, we're supportive of the council's assessment, and I would just clarify that in terms of the comment on a bulge. An encroachment. The parcel, our client's land at W9 is parcel 036 in documents EL004, which doesn't have that same conclusion as Group F. But no, we don't have anything further to add to the council assessment. We agree with the conclusions on there being strong boundaries.
I'm asking a question about recognisable hard boundaries. I moved on from the assessment. That question. It's really what I'm trying to define now is basically whether in each case there are hard recognisable boundaries in relation to each individual parcel land. So I want to try and keep my sort of comments to that rather than going back to the assessment. I've got the points in relation to the previous questions.
Yes, sorry, my reference to parcel 036, we agree with the description of the boundaries that's in that assessment. So yeah. Okay.
So any other points raised in relation to W11? I think we've obviously covered that in terms of the the references made to the railway line, I think, in South Lane, I think, Mr. Developers. And again, if Mr. Saunders, do you want to make any comments on relation to W49?
Nothing further to add, sir.
Okay, that's fine. Okay. Is any of the comments really on relation to just the question in relation to whether each of the sites has recognisable hard defensible greenbelt boundaries? Whether there's any other questions in relation to that? No. Okay. If I could just literally on this on the greenbelt question, really in terms of we've obviously touched in matter 8 in relation to exceptional circumstances, the overview. It's just obviously if I could just get the council's view on the sites in relation to North East Widnes, the exceptional sites that are here to alter the greenbelt, what was looked at, what reasonable alternatives were considered in meeting the needs for the development in terms of looking at the possible alternatives in terms of brownfield vacant land, surplus public land, optimising housing density, and then also discussions with neighbouring local authorities, for instance. So, Mr. Cross, if you just give me a clear line on this, please.
Yes, thank you, sir. I think a lot of this was covered at a previous session. Yes, we did go through the process of looking at the sort of the sequential search for sites. I say we looked at land within the urban area and concluded that there wasn't enough deliverable sites within the urban area to meet the identified requirements. We then were committed to undertaking a greenbelt review by the previous examination into the core strategy. We have been talking to, we have obviously asked our neighbouring authorities whether or not they are able to take any surplus requirement from Halton, and all of the neighbouring authorities are having to resort to the greenbelt to meet their own needs. Knowsley has recently, and their recently adopted plan, well, maybe not quite so recently adopted plan, but 4 years ago, took significant areas of land out of the greenbelt, created new urban villages to meet their requirements. Warrington is in the process of preparing their plan. It seems to have stalled slightly, but they are taking a huge amount of land out of the greenbelt to meet their requirements, so they're not able to meet our needs. And St Helens, who with Warrington are within the same identified housing market area, are preparing their plan. They are currently at examination, and they too are similarly taking land out of the greenbelt in order to meet their own needs. So none of the neighbouring authorities are in a position to basically accommodate the displaced demand for Halton within their existing urban areas. So that option wasn't available to us. So effectively we have no option but the recourse to the greenbelt. In terms of density, sort of making best use of the urban land, say we have looked at, we do have a density policy within the plan. We propose a minimum of 30 dwellings per hectare and minimum of 40 dwellings per hectare in more accessible locations.
Mr. Cross, just briefly, can we just try and obviously keep, because obviously the exceptional circumstances still need to be made at a site level. I just wanted, rather than the general case made, I wondered if you could just try and be a bit more specific about the exceptional circumstances in relation to the particular sites in North East Widnes. If you could just be absolutely clear on the point I'm asking. Thank you.
Well, sorry, sir. I say effectively it's difficult to deal with the sites without dealing with them in the round. Obviously, we have identified requirements for development to meet the needs of the Widnes community. We've identified that there is a shortfall. As mentioned at the beginning of the session, there's very few options available to the council in order to go into in order to find additional land. We either basically build to the north of Widnes, or we build to the south of Widnes. Given the scale of the shortfall, we're all having to do both. So we feel that the Greenbelt assessment in terms of how we've approached identifying the sites for potential release provides a justification for the choice of sites that we've made. So I'm not sure what we can say beyond that.
Okay, can I just bring Mr. Harper in, please?
Actually, it's Colleen Harper at this stage. If I may please speak. With regards to exceptional circumstances and land availability elsewhere, could I first of all just remind everybody about the lack of actual delivery windfalls that can take into account, potential windfalls, take into account into the DALP, which are important. But also, could I ask, in discussions with Warrington Borough Council particularly, we've got the land at Fiddler's Ferry, the Fiddler's Ferry Power Station, which is part of the village of Curedley, which historically has considered itself as part of Widnes. St Luke's Church in Farnworth actually has a Curedley chapel, which enables residents from there to be able to access the church without having to go through the main door, would you believe? So that it's historically considered part of Widnes, and you've got a huge site there which is no longer going to be used as a power station. And what are the discussions with regard to Warrington Borough Council as to the use of that land, and if it is to be used for housing, could not some of the Halton allocation be accommodated there?
Mr. Cross, if you just want to come back on those points, if you could, please.
Yes, the Fiddler's Ferry Power Station, I believe, has now finally closed. I think it had about 4 or 5 closing dates, but it has now officially closed. I believe Warrington is in discussion with the site owner, Scottish and Southern Electric, with regards to the future reuse of the site. We believe that the buildings are to be demolished and the site cleared. I think the site owner is in discussions as to the future reuse, and I think that they are looking at the potential for some housing and some employment. I think the demolition phase is probably going to take around 5 years whenever they start, so the site's not available in the short term. However, I say in terms of looking at Warrington's sort of housing requirement, I think they were looking at, for about 1,100 units per annum. I'm sure they won't be seeing that site as very much as contributing towards their requirement, and they have not offered it up as a potential for meeting the needs of Widnes. Whenever the plan was being drafted, I say the power station was still operational. Warrington hasn't said that they see that site as contributing towards Widnes's housing needs.
Okay, Mr. Gilbert, if I could just go to W9 first, just in terms of the exceptional circumstances in relation to what is your view in relation to basically that particular site, whether the exceptional circumstances are applied to altering the greenbelt in that particular instance, and what do you think the reasonable alternatives have been considered in relation to the assessment of that site?
Yeah, thank you, sir. I think the unfortunately, to go back to a similar point that Mr. Cross made, that in looking in the wider view, I think you've had our representations on exceptional circumstances, and to form exceptional circumstances is a test with essentially on one hand the level of need that's required that can't be met outside the greenbelt, and on the other hand you've got an assessment of harm to the greenbelt for those sites coming forward. And I think the strategic location 7 as a whole, and especially our sites at W9 and our part of W11 are the best performing sites in the borough. You've got a need that's being driven by a need to rebalance housing market. The housing market to the north of the river, which we went through in matter 3, and on the harm side of things, we argue that our sites are the best, or northeast Widnes is the best performing or least performing, well performing extent of the greenbelt. as a whole, and in particular W9 and our part of W11, which have been shown to have only a partial contribution within the council's assessment. So it's nothing new, unfortunately, sir, but if we do think, if it's not a beauty parade, we don't argue there's a beauty parade to be had, but if there were to be one, we think that North East Widnes would win it.
Okay, Mr. Coxon, do you want to just make just your views in terms of the same point in relation to W11, please? Why the exceptional circumstances apply in relation to this particular site?
Thank you, sir. Well, I would agree with the comments of Mr. Gilbert, and I won't repeat those in terms of the overall position, but certainly, sir, I would refer you to map 12B of the Greenbelt assessment. And I think that's the point that Mr. Cross was making in terms of if you need to release Greenbelt, and then you need to release Greenbelt to meet the needs of Widnes as well. I think that map just sets it out in very kind of overall terms. You will go to the northeast of Widnes, and then obviously for the reasons we discussed earlier in terms of Greenbelt impact allied with the considerations on these sites, so it's a sustainable location, the impacts in terms of infrastructure and so on can be mitigated. I think combined those comprise the exceptional circumstances. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Saunders, if you could, again, just point the question really in relation to W49 as well, please. If you could just ask, the exceptional circumstances that apply in relation to that specific site again, please, if we could find out your views on that, please.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Try not to cover too much ground that colleagues have just run through on the other sites, but yeah, there seems to be a spatial understanding that this is well best placed to accommodate Halton's needs to then also tap into the wider sub-regional market as well. I think in terms of its sustainability credentials, it scores very highly against, as Mr. Cross has gone through, the balance of harm and impact, which is splitting exceptional circumstances down. Firstly, whether or not there are exceptional circumstances are legal points, but then obviously the judgment on whether you think there are exceptional circumstances are planning balance. And I think as we just run through in the Greenbelt assessment question a little earlier, these are low scoring, generally speaking, and speaking on my client site mainly, as I can, it scores very lowly. It's low scoring against the Greenbelt function tests, and therefore, if we're minded to support the council's approach to its sequential approach to this, then it does represent the necessary position to release land to accommodate the future needs for Halton Borough.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other points to raise on at this particular point in time on the Greenbelt review, exceptional circumstances issue? Okay, thank you. I'm just going to move on to the next part of the agenda, just in relation to the scale and the dwelling capacity. So again, just looking through each of the sites, basically in relation to North East Widnes, starting with W9, please can the council state how the site area and dwelling capacity was determined? Are the assumptions justified and based on available evidence in regard to any constraints and the provision of necessary infrastructure? Mr. Cross.
Yes, thank you, sir. That our response is set out in our matter statement to question 12B5. Basically, if we just quickly run through all of the sites, W9, the capacity is informed by developer submission. The other sites where the capacities were assessed by the application of the standard calculation, which is basically the site area times the assumed developable proportion of the site, which was for smaller sites, we assume a larger area can be developed, and for larger sites, a smaller area, times 30 dwellings per hectare. So for W9, the developer submission identified the potential for 475 dwellings.
Okay, thank you. if we just could get basically some views from the developer, starting with W9 in terms of the site area development capacity. Are the assumptions justified and based on available evidence in terms of constraints and provision of necessary infrastructure? If we just ask Mr. Gilbert then, starting with W9.
Yes, sir, they are, and Mr. Cross referred to our submissions, which we've been working on with the council. I've appended those to our hearing statements for our Matter 12B statement. And you have there 2 statements which will be relevant to today's session, which we call our land at Mill Green Farm, which is our site submission for W9, and land off Barrows Green Lane, which is our proportion of W11. The council's conclusions follow our submissions. We also, at our submissions in August 2019, submitted a suite of technical documents which related to highways, flood risk and ecology, and those are appended to Appendix 2 and 3 of our August 2019 submissions. It's not my intention to go through those here, so I think they're fairly conclusive as to the deliverability of our site. The only addition to the information you have had, sir, is since the August 2019 submissions, we've met with the council to talk about the effect of the viaduct which goes across site W9, and we have re-envisaged a master plan, an indicative master plan, which deals with that element, but that doesn't result in any loss of development capacity, indicative development capacity. The viaduct is just incorporated into our open space strategy. So.
Okay, thank you. Okay, if I just, there's any developed contributions in terms of the W10, if I could go to W11 maybe. Again, Mr. Coxon, I think if you want to pick up those questions, please, in relate to the site areas and development capacity, dwelling capacity.
Thank you, sir. No, we're content, sir, with the density assumptions that have been applied. It's a realistic way of assessing draft allocations of this scale. Clearly, there'll be matters to bottom out at planning application stage, but most likely across sites of this scale, across the whole of SRL 7, it's appropriate to kind of use averages in this way, and the council's assumptions reflect possibly ever so slightly conservative, but they reflect the fact that even if some constraints aren't resolved, so for example, we anticipate that the overhead electricity lines within site W11 will be able to remove them. However, even if they were to be retained with easements, we still would be confident that those densities can be achieved.
Okay, thank you. Okay, if I just move on to W49, please, if we just get Mr. Saunders' view just on the densities, the constraint issues that we've just been discussing again.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I think we've used the basis of the density calculation that the council have done, as you would when any technical team then takes it on. Obviously, Miller and now got a contract to take forward the site. So there has been a period of technical appraisal, which I think has added to that layer. The natural assets of the site it largely revolve around the Bower Brook, which bisects the site, and ultimately it does lead to a quite an extensive area through the central area of the site, which can be used to the benefit of the development, but also does reduce potential unit yield. Now, I've put that in our statement in a rather unique way of just trying to assist the examination. I think what we'd say is if the site allocation stayed as is, we wouldn't want that reduction in unit number taken forward. It's more of just to show you how we are looking at all various options to do with different house types and so on as well. So I think I just wanted to make that point to you, sir.
Okay. Okay, is there any other submissions on this issue relating to the evidence to support the site areas and development capacities that have been used by the council at this stage and those put forward by the developers? Yep, Mr. Harper. If you just unmute, please, thank you.
Colleen again, rather than the sites that have been talked about. I mean, obviously, we don't want these to go ahead at all, but just in case we are unsuccessful in trying to protect this area, they're talking about the number of houses per hectare, etc., in that area, and to cram as many in basically as they possibly can. But is there an assumption that all the access to these new housing estates would all come onto either Luntheath Road or Mill Lane, South Lane area? And would that not cause some technical issues for everybody, those who live here currently and the people who might like to consider buying a house there? And also, there is no allocation in that wide area, and the numbers that you're talking about for any schooling, doctors, clinics, etc. So have these things been taken into consideration at all? Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll probably be covering the infrastructure and constraints highway issues later in the agenda. But Mr. Cross, do you want to just make it just before we break? I'm just going to take a short break. If there's any comments you want to just make on that point at this stage, but we'll come back to this in more detail, I think, shortly in the agenda.
Yes, thank you, sir. Obviously, yes, the highways implications have been considered. You have the reports in front of you in terms of the update to the Liverpool City Region traffic model, which effectively looked at the impact of all the proposed allocation sites within the plan. In terms of schooling, again, we have provided information from the latest EduBase figures showing the capacity for school places across the borough, which clearly shows that there is not a deficit of school places within the borough, despite the, anecdotal evidence of people not being able to necessarily get into their preferred school of Wade Deacon. There are sufficient places across the borough to meet the schooling needs of the potential population.
If I could pick up this issue, if you're going to come back on those points, Mr. Harper and Mrs. Harper, if I could just pick up, I want to pick up those points under highways and the infrastructure requirements issues relating to prime school places. If I could just pick up those on a later part of the agenda, if that's okay. Are those the points you want to raise, is it?
Well, at this point, all I was going to say was that in certain areas, Widnes and Runcorn are being considered as two separate towns, but not when it comes to education. And if you live in North Widnes, you don't want to be sending your child to a school 5 miles away in South Runcorn. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much for your contributions. We're going to take a short break, a bit of a comfort break really from the screen. If we could come back at 11:30, please, to resume then. So if I just adjourn the hearing till 11:30, if we come back at that point promptly. Thank you. Okay, it's 11:30. I'll just resume the hearing again, if you could, please. I'll just start with the moving on to potential adverse impacts mitigation and policy mitigation in relation to each of the sites in North East Widnes. We can start with site W9. Please could the council state what are the potential adverse impacts of developing the site and how these can be mitigated, for example, in terms of transport, traffic pollution, nature conservation, landscape and countryside, heritage assets, and the impact on flood risk, etc. Would the policy safeguards and proposed mitigation be sufficiently effective? Mr. Cross.
Thank you, sir. Again, we've summarised, I've taken an extract from the site appraisal, sustainability appraisal table in our response to question 12B.6, and that shows identifies against the 17 objectives how the various sites perform. The only negatives that are identified in North Widnes are soil, and that's effectively primarily the loss of agricultural land. There are some negative impacts or potential negative impacts identified for heritage, which is effectively just identifying or recognising the proximity to heritage assets, either listed probably listed buildings within the area, and some negative impacts identified in relation to water. And again, that will be because there are some water courses affected are going through some of the sites. In terms of the mitigation for water, obviously primarily on W49, I say we have specifically identified the creation of a green corridor along the water course to basically protect the environmental quality of the route, and to avoid obviously any impact on potential impact of on the water course that could lead to adverse flood issues elsewhere. Other than that, to say there is some potential negative impacts identified on health. So I think that was just primarily in relation to proximity to existing facilities, health facilities.
Okay.
In terms of transport, obviously, I say we have undertaken the borough-wide transport assessment. We are proposing a number of developments along, I say, the east-west corridor that goes across North Widnes. The intention has been and is that we've provided a consistent evidence base, and that's been made available to each of the developers and their transport consultants, so that we basically have consistent base data to work on to assess or assess the impact of the individual developments and the cumulative impact. And we hope to be able to work with the developers on a coordinated approach so that we don't just have piecemeal improvements. We can actually have the developers, making contributions in a coordinated manner so that we can ensure that any additional capacity that needs to be put in at individual junctions can be addressed in a coherent manner.
Okay, and just obviously the second part of that question was, would the policy safeguards and proposed mitigation be sufficiently effective?
The council believes so.
Okay. Mr. Gilbert, do you want to just come in on this question, please, in relation to W9?
Yeah, thank you, sir. Just refer you back to our submissions, which we've appended to our hearing statements, which provide an assessment of each site in terms of its opportunities and constraints, and provides a full site assessment, including on matters of flood risk, drainage, highways and utilities. We've demonstrated in those submissions, sir, there's no barriers to the development we say can come forward. And indeed, subject or save for comments we've made at other matters, we don't have any difficulty in providing a policy compliance scheme in line with the emerging local plan, sir.
Okay. Any other comments on relation to this particular question in relation to W9, the land at Mill Green Farm? Okay, I'm just going to move on to W10 then, if I could please. Same question really in relation to same issues. Mr. Cross.
Again, probably the answer goes to all the sites, sir.
Okay. So if we could go to basically the views of the developers on W11, if I could please, just in terms of the potential adverse impacts, mitigations and policy mitigations, if you could just cover those. I think, Mr. Gilbert, you may have covered that in relation to your part of the site.
So yeah, I have, sir. I would just add that with that information, we beyond the submissions you've had attached to our hearing statement, is the technical appendices, which does look at the distribution of traffic flows from both our sites, W9 and our part of W11, and demonstrates that the immediate highway network can safely accommodate the traffic from our sites. In terms of the wider transport issues, they go to the other matters that we've already discussed there, and the strategic options for accommodating growth, which we've dealt with in part one of the examination, sir.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Coxon, do you want to raise some issues in relation to the same point in relation to W11, please?
Well, thank you, sir. Yes. Well, you already have our written submissions on these points, sir, but to run through very, very briefly, my client's undertaken some technical assessments. We've presented that information to the council. There are considered to be no constraints to a policy compliant and ultimately sustainable development. Ecology has been looked at. I referred earlier, sir, to the electricity pylons which have been considered. The noise from the railway is not considered to be insurmountable, and indeed the development that I referred to at the start of this session to the southwest, which was an allocation in a previous plan, that is also adjacent to the railway line, and acceptable levels of amenity have been achieved. Just finally, in terms of highways, we've submitted information on highways that demonstrates that the site benefits from good levels of accessibility, that safe and suitable access can be achieved to South Lane, and finally that I would agree with what Mr. Gilbert said in terms of the overall strategic impacts, but traffic impacts obviously will be assessed through transport assessments at the application stage, and we would fully anticipate and we support that will also look at cumulative impacts.
Okay, can I just pick up on a point that was raised? I noticed in relation, and when I was on site, I noticed obviously in relation to W11, there's a linear feature, a stream and a pool, a pond, basically, so a water feature and a hedge basically along the southern side of the edge, identified as a linear feature in the Liverpool City region NIA and ecology network. I just wanted to find out how that would be addressed as part of the development. I think if that's possible. I think it's it's basically there's some land at there's an existing development at obviously Boundary Stone Lane and off Barrow Green Lane.
Yeah, thank you, sir. There is a brook that runs through the site, and it is anticipated that would be retained as part of effectively a green corridor. So it would form part of the green infrastructure. Clearly, it's anticipated the brook would be used as part of the overall sustainable drainage strategy. But just to address, I think, also the point you've raised there cross-refers to a point Mr. Cross referred to earlier in terms of water, impact on water and the any water bodies in the watercourse. Obviously, there would be mitigation in terms of control for runoff and so on.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Yes, if I can move to, I think we covered the point in relation to W40, which is the land, basically the only issue, I guess, but it's obviously got an existing development, the land that is effectively the Watkinson Way loop. The only issues raised there I could see were particularly in relation to noise, but I understand there's an existing development there, Mr. Cross, I think you mentioned earlier, so that detail has been addressed, is it, in relation to that particular site?
I believe so, sir. As I say, it's the resolution to approve the outline consent for 42 apartments.
Okay, fine. If we could just move on to W49 then, just Mrs. Saunders, then again, if you could just, again, the potential adverse impacts mitigation and if the policy mitigations are there to safeguard the development of this site, please.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I think in the first instance, I'd say that we've done significant technical due diligence on the site over what is now a 3-year period, and so we feel well placed to say that we don't believe there is any adverse impacts likely as a result of the development. If we go back to, I won't cover highways matters now because I guess we've got a question coming up on those points anyway, but you'll note that we've appended a highways note to our submission which covers a site-specific consideration of our development and some initial junction modelling exercises and capacity exercises for your benefit. We've used a lot of desk-based work that we were past historically when the wider Lunts Heath site was being considered in 2017, as what Mr. Cross was saying, when that was being promoted as a wider allocation. So it's fair to say there's a number of consultants all worked on this over a period of time, and what we've done is fine-tune it to be more specific to how Miller Homes want to bring the site forward, which is more about using the assets of the site, as I mentioned earlier, rather than ignoring them. And we've included an illustrative master plan for the benefit of the examination, which shows what we've called Cranshaw Greenway at Appendix 4 of our statement, which will go through the centre of the site, which is what Mr. Cross was saying about ensuring that remains open. We've modelled the standoff areas that are required, both from an ecological and a drainage perspective, and are proposing to use natural swales and drainage basins as part of the central area of the site to promote best green infrastructure, but also recreational value for the site as well. So we'd like to think that the site is capable of creating a high quality development, and other than what Mr. Cross has mentioned, I don't believe there's any further policy safeguards required to control development.
Just in relation again, the habitat issue in relation to, I think you mentioned the brook, the linear feature of the brook going through the site, but also there's a pond mentioned in the site assessments as a stepping stone feature in the basically the Liverpool City region NRI and ecological network. Just how that would be addressed, really, that biodiversity issue as well. I think you mentioned how you would address the brook, but it's just obviously the pond feature. I think I've noticed when I was on site, I noticed there was on the far sort of eastern side of the site.
Yeah, I think that was picked up in the preliminary ecological assessment as well, and it's going to be party to further investigations as we bring forward our scheme as a whole. Ultimately, that may make tweaks to the layout, but ultimately something that, as a whole, the consultants believe the site doesn't have a high ecological value, and we can use it and utilise what is there as part of our wider infrastructure support development. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. Is there any other issues anybody wishes to raise on the potential adverse impacts and mitigations in relation to the sites in North East Widnes at this stage? Mr. Gilbert, yes.
Thank you, sir. Just if it's helpful for W11, I wanted to double check that our ecological assessment picked up specifically that watercourse and its tree line nature, and it does. That's in Appendix 2 of our August 2019 representations, and I think that the conclusions of that assessment would probably apply all along the length of the watercourse, albeit it's only assessed our extent of the site, sir.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much for that. Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to move on to the highways issue, basically what the effect of the overall allocations are on the local and strategic highway network. There's obviously some points been raised regarding that. And obviously picking up on the point, I think it was in the council submission regarding the transport model for the local plan. I think it referred to obviously the increased traffic by 2035, and could lead to overcapacity and localised improvement requirements, particularly at Moorfield Road and the Derby Road roundabout. I wonder if you could just give some indication about how that particular issue could be addressed, basically.
Thank you, sir. As you say, yes, the overall impact of the plan was assessed by Mark McDonald's, but via an updated Liverpool City region traffic model, which is evidence document EL091, and it did identify some pinch points. Obviously, as you've heard today, that the number of the parties have been undertaking technical evidence to show the potential impact of their particular developments and to show that their sites, they believe, are developable in highway terms. Before I bring Mr. Peake in, I say probably just qualify that those submissions haven't been signed off by our highways department, but having said that, our highways department have looked at each of the sites and are satisfied that satisfactory access can be achieved. So whilst we haven't yet signed off on the technical work in relation to the individual sites, I believe our highways department are content that the satisfactory arrangements can be achieved on each of them. But in terms of the individual pinch points, then perhaps Mr. Peake could be able to provide some additional detail.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Yes, we've looked at the two pinch points in question when we were consulted on the draft allocation plan, and it is a case of it's the Moorfield Road roundabout and the Derby Road, Lunts Heath road junctions that do seem to be impacted on by the future developments. This said, there is considered to be suitable mitigations that could be implemented at both junctions. Obviously, the cost of the developers, either cumulatively or as a standalone, dependent on the development coming forward as the development process continues through. There is road space available to implement widenings. There are options for changes and improvements to signalised junctions to deal with the increased capacity. We would say that all the sites in question do have access onto the highway network, and there are multiple connection points that are considered to be suitable.
Okay, thank you. Any contribution from the developers on this point, or any other parties in terms of impact to developments on the localised network? Mr. Harper?
Okay, it's Colleen.
Okay, yeah.
But the multiple was used there for connection points. Do you mean to say that you're going to create some new roads, or, as I asked earlier, is everything just going to come down onto Lunts Heath Road and South Lane?
Yeah, Mr. Peake, do you want to just have what your understanding is? Obviously, the developers can obviously come in as well, just to say how you foresee from the information that's been submitted, how that will basically be catered for in the network itself, and where improvements might be needed, please.
Yes, that's no problems. I can expand on that slightly. As I say, sites W11, W10, W9 main access points obviously are onto the Derby Road South Lane corridor. In terms of multiple points of connections, the task I was taking was, in general, that the sites could have resilience in terms of building onto the network. So looped systems within the internal layouts could be achieved, which have multiple points of access into the site. The site W11, there is an ancillary point that feeds through into Barrows Green Lane. There was a recent residential development, I believe it was a Red Road development, that is accessed off Barrows Green Lane. There are, from what I'm aware, links to the north and certainly to the east of that site that would link into W11, which gives alternatives for residents and obviously filters into the resilience. W9 has got adopted carriageway to all sides, therefore there are options to take connections to Mill Lane out towards the Rivendell Garden Centre, and multiple points of connection onto Derby Road at that particular point, prior between Moorfield Road and Barrows Green Lane. That stretch of network is a substantial width. It is a reasonable width of carriageway, and it would carry with a capacity for movements along it. The Lunts Heath site, which I believe is it W49.
Yeah.
Again, that will discharge solely onto Lunts Heath just because of the location of the site. But as part of the development process, it would be expected to wash its own face in terms of mitigation against impact on the local network. So the roads will carry more traffic than at present, but it's not considered to result in an adverse impact on either capacity or road safety. Although I'd caveat that is separate to more detailed information as the development process goes through. So the Highways Authority will have the opportunity to feed into that consultation process and help steer development and design to ensure that the schemes coming forward do meet all the requirements.
Okay, thank you. Any points from the developers on this in addition, Mr. Harper or Mrs. Harper?
It's Mr. Harper this time.
Okay.
Sorry, just a quick clarification really. Is the intention to improve Mill Lane at all? I know it was mentioned just now that there could be a connection to Mill Lane from W9. Is the intention to leave it as it is, or to actually do some improvements onto it? Because it's pretty bad at the moment. Thank you.
Mr. Peake, or if the developers, Mr. Gilbert, maybe could just...
It's Mr. Peake again, sir, if that's okay. As I said, no improvements are stated or envisaged because the level of detail provided at the moment is not of that requirement. That will follow through as part of the development process. I'm not 100% sure which stretch of Mill Lane Mr. Harper may have been referring to. There is a section of between two roundabouts that is a one-way link only. If that's the section in question, I don't believe there's any changes to that potential that aspect considered. If he's discussing further sort of north towards the Rivendell Garden Centre, again, that'll be completely dependent on the application that comes forward and the access arrangements into potential development. So it'll all be part and parcel rolled up into a complete holistic scheme.
Mr. Gilbert, do you have anything to raise on this particular issue?
Yes, I think as Mr. Peake said, we'll be dealing. These are sort of matters for a detailed plan application, but in terms of the technical note that we provided on transport distribution, I just wanted to stress that our primary access is envisaged onto the western boundary of W9, onto the roundabout at Mill Lane, and the modelling of traffic distribution for our site shows broadly 75% of our traffic would be going either north or south on the A557 rather than sort of east-west on the Derby Road, albeit to head north on the 557 it would need to go through the roundabout you referred to earlier, sir. But we've really, with our technical information, sought to show that we can achieve a suitable access, and that our site on its own, it can be accommodated on the highway network, which, as Mr. Peake said, is not insubstantial at the moment. On Mill Green Lane, the northern and eastern boundaries of our site, it's not envisaged at the moment that we'd be providing any access onto those roads. Again, that can be dealt with at a planning application stage, but our primary access is envisaged onto the western boundary at the roundabout, and there is potential for a southern secondary access onto Derby Road.
Okay, thank you. Any other points to raise on the localised impact of the development on the localised network? If not, could I just, there's a point raised, I think, previously when we discussed about the impact on the motorway network. Is an issue raised by Highways England? I think it's raised in the council's submission regarding the cumulative impact in the wider region, including the development at North East Widnes on junction 7 of the M62. I know some initial work has been done. We've talked about this under the highways issues. I just wanted to really just cover that issue whilst we're talking about North East Widnes and how the cumulative impacts would be dealt with in terms of the strategic road network. Is it Mr. Peake, is it? Yeah, Mr. Cross.
Thank you, sir. Yes, obviously, Highways England raised some concerns regarding each of the motorway junctions within the borough. I think we've managed to satisfy them regarding most of them. They did have a slight outstanding concern regarding junction 7 on the M62. As I said, however, that's the impact of the Halton plan is probably a small proportion of that. It's the contribution from the proposals or traffic generated in the authorities lying immediately to the north. I believe the scheme is, there is a draft scheme has been looked at for junction improvements, and that is in the infrastructure plan as being addressed at the city region level. So we don't consider that it's particularly an issue that will affect the development or bringing forward development in North Widnes. And I don't believe that we will be seeking contributions from any of the developments in North Widnes towards that.
Okay, any other points to raise in relation to that particular point from other participants? No. Okay, if I could just move on to the infrastructure requirements costs, basically in relation to the sites in North East Widnes. If we could look at Solus site W9, what the council state would be the infrastructure requirements costs and how they would be addressed.
Thank you, sir. Obviously, we had the session on the whole plan viability study that looked in detail at a range of sites, and the participants at that session all concluded that the plan was viable or was deliverable. We believe, yes, there will be sort of maybe some site-specific issues on some sites. Obviously, the off-site highways being the key thing, but we don't believe that there's been any specific requirements identified that would prejudice the delivery of any of the sites.
Okay. Comments really in relation to the developers, W9 in relation to Mr. Gilbert.
Thank you, sir. No, you've had our comments on how development costs should be incorporated into the viability assessment, which I think is a separate matter. As a whole, sir, we're content that our site's deliverable broadly in line with the planning policy requirements of the emerging local plan. I think as we get into any detailed, as with any planning application, as we get into the very detailed elements of it, those will be subject to discussion with the council, but there's nothing broadly within the plan at the moment, sir, that we're concerned about being compatible with.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Coxon, anything to raise in relation to W11?
No, nothing to add, sir. I think Mr. Gilbert's comments probably apply equally applicably to my client's site. They've undertaken internal development appraisals, and that's based on the technical information that they've been undertaken to prepare a planning application, and together with any buffers that they allow for in terms of infrastructure costs. So even if, say, it's decided at application stage education contributions are required, my client would consider that to be viable. So no issues, sir. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Saunders, just in relation to W49.
Thank you, sir. Keeping it simple, we've got nothing further to add, no concerns.
Okay, just pick up on this issue raised earlier, and obviously during and through the submissions, I've obviously picked up on the issue of discussions of the education and school places planning team regarding primary and secondary school places. Could just confirm what the outcome really is? I know you've touched on it earlier, but what is the agreed position in relation to the sites in North East Widnes, Mr. Cross?
Yes, thank you, sir. I think it's in Appendix D to my Matter 12 statement. I provide the information from the latest government's EDU-based system, which sets out the capacities and the current role, so the occupancy at each of the schools across Halton as at December last year. That clearly shows that there is currently excess capacity identified within Halton. In Widnes, the primary schools has capacity for 5,086 pupils. Currently, the occupancy is at 95%, so there's spare places for 262 pupils at primary schools. Secondary schools, there's capacity for 4,153, and the occupancy is currently at 91% with spare capacity for 354 pupils. Obviously, yes, they say there are a couple of schools reporting over capacity. And Widnes, they say, as mentioned previously, Wade Beacon is currently reporting that it's running at 107% capacity. I should just state that with the academisation of schools, these schools are not local authority controlled. It is at the gift of the individual schools to declare the number of pupils that they can accommodate. It's a view of our school places planning staff that Wade Beacon is under-reporting its capacity, and the fact that it's actually running at 107% at the moment suggests that that's very much the case. But there is clear capacity within the system at the moment. I would also draw your attention to the figures in our annual monitoring report, so document SD16A, and in that we have we set out the latest population projections at AMR POP 10.21, and that document looks specifically at the school age population. And I think it was mentioned or discussed at a previous session that there's been a bit of a spike of going through the school system, where the numbers in individual year groups had sort of spiked by something just under 1,000, and that is working its way, or had worked its way through the primary school system, and was now feeding through or working its way through the secondary schools. Looking at the projected population age 5 to 11, currently there was forecast to peak at around 2018 at 11,868, and at the end of the plan period it's expected to be 10,300. So that's a drop of 1,561, or 13% reduction in the primary school age pupils. Obviously, these are ONS population projections, so they're based on past trends, particularly over the last 5 years, so they don't take account of any development activity. But I think it's quite clear, with a 13% drop in the population aged of primary school age, that there's certainly sufficient capacity within the existing education estate to accommodate any pupils that will arise from any new development. The situation in the secondary school age pupils is a little bit different. As I said, the spike in the individual years is still currently working its through. The last of the spike is coming out of the primary schools and going into the secondary schools. So actually there is a forecast increase in the population aged 12 to 17. At the moment, it's estimated to be about 9,500. It's estimated to peak at about 10,400 before falling back at the end of the plan period to 9,100. So over the plan period, it's about a 4% drop. But obviously, I say yes, there is a spike working its way through the system at the moment. That's projected to peak in 2025. So effectively, anything that this plan does is unlikely to impact on the outcome of that. As I said, looking back at the EduBase figures, that identifies that there is capacity. It was mentioned about pupils being basically bussed out of the borough. I do believe that whenever we last spoke to our school place colleagues, they effectively confirmed that no pupil has been allocated a school that was not on their parents' preference choice. So every pupil has been allocated a space in either the first, second, or third preference. A number of parents may well have expressed a preference for school outside the borough, and in some cases that may well have been accommodated.
Okay, thank you. Mr. or Mrs. Harper?
Thank you very much. I'd just like to point out, in the last 10 years, there's been an increase in houses in North Widnes of 800 plus, in Appleton of 500 plus. And in that period of time, a secondary school has been closed in this area, and this has caused a big problem with the people that currently live here. And as Mr. Cross has said, if you're selecting schools, you've got basically 2 schools in Widnes plus the faith school, which is Catholic. After that, your third choice is Penketh High School, maybe. So it's no surprise that we're finding that people are actually getting their third choice and having to move outside the borough, and absolutely nothing's been done. Essentially, the additional houses have come in, 800, I say, plus in the last 10 years, and no services have been added. In fact, they've been reduced, including, say, Wilmere Lane playing fields, which are now closed to the public, which was, of course, quite recent. But there's no plan at all in this DALP to allocate any land in North Widnes for additional services. The pressure on the doctors and the surgeries is increasing. It takes weeks to get a normal appointment these days. So, it's all about getting the money in from the houses and not about providing the services that the people need.
Mr. Cross, could I just touch on, obviously, just the point that Mr. Harper made, obviously, particularly, I suppose, in relation to discussions with the public health team and the NHS, the clinical commissioning group regarding maybe healthcare services and GP facilities, obviously what the position may be in relation to the health service issue. You may also pick up on the point made by Mr. Harper regarding the obviously increase in dwellings over, obviously the last while, and obviously the obviously services or facilities obviously being lost. I wonder if you could cover that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly, sir. As I say, as I'm sure Mr. Harper's aware, that the provision of health facilities isn't in the gift of the Borough Council. Effectively, yes, we do work with our colleagues in the health service, the CCG, in terms of where they identify a requirement for additional surgery provision. We do seek to work with them to facilitate that. I would, before I discuss that, I would just make sort of 2 points. Yes, we see obviously houses have been built in certain locations. It doesn't necessarily follow that over the wider area that the population has increased. In fact, I think in some of the inner wards where they haven't seen development, the reduction in average household size has actually led to a net reduction in the overall population. The fact that the demand for appointments at GP surgeries is increasing is probably more driven by the ageing population. I believe that like a 60 or 70-year-old will on average visit the GP about 9 to 14 times a year, as compared to 1 or 2 times a year for a 30-year-old. So the increase in demand has been driven by the ageing of the population rather than the provision of additional houses. In terms of, I say, providing new facilities, I say yes, we do work with our colleagues in health, and where they identify a requirement for new facilities or replacement facilities, we do work with them to try and facilitate that. There's probably some recent examples we have as part of the Castlefields redevelopment in Runcorn. The previous facility was demolished and replaced with a more modern facility with larger capacity. In Widnes at the moment, I believe we are working with our colleagues, or have been working with our colleagues, to help secure the provision of GP facilities at the Upton Rocks Local Centre. And perhaps my colleague Andrew Plant could provide additional detail if you need some additional detail on that scheme. Other than that, I say we haven't had a request for additional assistance in identifying additional accommodation at this time.
Just on the question, just if we could just deal with that before we go to Mr. Plant on the obviously the facilities, increase in facilities. Also, just the question there about the increase in numbers and the impact of removal of sort of facilities, education facilities over the last while.
I think it's a little bit disingenuous to say the closure or the loss of a high school. As I'm sure Mr. Harper's well aware, the Fairfield High School was merged with Wade Deakin, and it was effectively the council was successful in securing the redevelopment of the Wade Deakin site. So the site has been comprehensively rebuilt, and the 2 schools merged onto the one site. That did free up the site of the former Fairfield High School, which has been partially developed for housing. I think the scheme's almost completed now, and it's also allowed the provision of a new cemetery for Widnes. The current Widnes cemetery was nearing capacity, so it has facilitated the provision of new cemetery. In terms of the capacity, as I say, shortly after the Building Schools for the Future, after we were successful in helping the school achieve its new accommodation, they immediately went for academy status, and I say the school role is now not within the gift of the council. It's for the school to declare its capacity and the number of pupils that it feels comfortable to accommodate.
Okay, Mr. Plant, you just raised the issue of improvements of the healthcare or GP facilities that was raised. Give us an update on that.
Yeah, thank you, sir. It was just to expand on the point that Mr. Cross made. Were new doctors' surgeries have either been identified or relocation. So the one referred to at Upton Rocks is a relocation of Appleton surgery to a much bigger and more modern facility than it currently exists. And again, as Mr. Cross referred to at Castlefield, there's been an improvement in the provision there where it's identified we've facilitated these in the past.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the update. Just wanted to, unless there's anything further just on those particular points, I just wanted to raise just the issue of access, the access by sustainable means of transport, basically particularly bus services, etc., basically to the site. So I wonder if you could just confirm, maybe the council. I know that I noticed there were submissions there in relation to access from this area, North East Widnes, to services and facilities, say in local town centres, either Widnes or elsewhere. I wonder if you also just give me an update on basically that particular point.
Yes, thank you, sir. I believe that the majority of the sites, I think all of the sites are, part of all of the sites are within 400 metres of a bus stop. I think there are some parts of possibly W4 that are maybe just slightly out with the 400 metre walk, but the majority of the sites are entirely within the 400 metre walk from existing bus stops and existing services.
And do you know what those services consist of? Just if you could just give me a quick overview, basically, if that's okay. I'd maybe.
I might have to defer to Mr. Plant with maybe a bit more local knowledge. Effectively, I say the services, unfortunately, the Haltons did have a municipal bus service. Unfortunately, that folded earlier in the year. I believe the majority of services have now been taken over by Arriva, with some additional services provided by Warrington Transport, now branded Warrington's buses. North Widnes does have some, I say it's probably served more by sort of cross-boundary services that come in from St Helens or from Knowsley or along South Lane from Warrington, which basically come in, run east-west, and then basically head down the Birchfield Road towards the town centre. So there's probably most of the stops will be served by multiple services. In terms of the overall frequency, I don't have that information immediately to hand, I'm afraid.
Okay. So are they sort of, every 30 minutes, every hour, basically, until they are fairly regular service? So, yeah, if I go to Mr. Harper, had his hand up first. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure whether it's relevant to this particular part of the discussion, but my understanding is that if you're going to take land out of Greenbelt these days, you have to make some sort of compensatory improvements to the Greenbelt, the local Greenbelt that's remaining. If that's the case, what's the plans for SRL 7? Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Gilbert, if you just cover the base of your points you want to raise, I'll just.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Can I take you to table 3? Well, you don't need to go to it now, sir, but table 3.1 of our technical note on transport sets out the bus services that are available along Derby Road, which are accessible to sites W9, W10 and W11. And that's, you've essentially got in the day a 30-minute service, and in the evening a 1-hour service for bus service 7, which is runs between Liverpool and Warrington. There are a couple of college services which obviously run twice a day, and then an hourly service, a loop service from Widnes, Farnworth and Cronton on service 26 and 26A.
Okay, thank you very much for that. That's very helpful. Thank you. Okay, Mr. Coxon.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I was going to point you to a similar technical note that's attached to our Regulation 19 representations, which sets out those services. The only point that I would add, which is hopefully useful to your deliberations, is at figure 9 of the Highways technical note that's appended to our Regulation 19 representations. That sets out a 60-minute public transport accessibility map, and that extends, that 60-minute area extends all the way over to Greater Manchester, all the way to Liverpool, Frodsham in Cheshire, and even Wigan, which is part of Greater Manchester, but to the north. So with those bus services, the accessibility of Northwest Widnes as a location is pretty good.
Okay, thank you. Okay, if just quickly touch on the compensatory measures just mentioned. Obviously, we have covered the issue under Greenbelt matters, but Mr. Cross, I don't know whether you've got any comments just to make on what Mr. Harper raised. Obviously, we are. It's obviously separate from infrastructure requirements, but I just wanted just to touch on that whilst it's in discussion.
Yes, sir. Obviously, as you say, this was discussed previously. A number of the sites basically were butting up against the borough boundary, and I say probably with differential ownerships, it is sort of it's been slightly difficult for some of the developers to make compensatory measures out with land in their control. Some of the sites, I say obviously the land holdings do make that easier. So I'm assuming the W49 was basically in the same ownership or ownerships as land that is proposed to be retained within the green belt, and that's certainly the case in terms of the sites in South Widnes, which we'll be discussing to Wednesday. So I think they say the intention was that the developers were basically looking to make, to incorporate improvements or, environmental improvements within the boundaries of the sites themselves.
Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to move on to just the physical and other constraints of the sites. Obviously, the submissions have been made. Basically, I wonder if there's any other points that the council wish to make in relation to any physical or other constraints from nearby land or on the proposed developments.
Yes, thank you, sir. Again, I say the individual site assessments each contain a section on physical constraints. For the most part, the majority of the sites aren't affected by adverse flood risk. I think there is maybe a small portion of W49 that's identified as flood zone 2, but obviously that will be being dealt with as part of their flood management or water management design as part of bringing the site forward. As with the majority of Widnes, certainly North Widnes, the site or the area is undermined and is subject to the standard consultation and requirements for the coal board. But for the most part, other than that, we don't envisage that there's any particular technical constraints or physical constraints that limit the development of these sites, other than obviously adjacent highways, railways, which will have to be the potential for noise will have to be incorporated into the design. I think this part is the sort of the one part of Widnes that isn't affected by HSE consultation zones, so we don't have to deal with that issue today.
Okay, just pick up on this point that obviously Mr. Gilbert raised earlier. It's obviously its relation to this the aqueduct easement through the site that you've got to propose as a greenway in site W9. Obviously United Utilities have raised that in terms of obviously having that for access. Do you think it's, I suppose the point was raised, obviously there's an area of proposed green space identified. Is it over prescriptive? I just wanted to raise that particular point, what your comments might be.
Obviously, whenever the sites were being identified, United Utilities were at pains to point out the presence of the Vernley Aqueduct. I believe it's basically one of the main water supplies for Liverpool. They are happy to see development within the area. They don't see that as being problematic. Obviously, subject to suitable standoff distances. You can put roads across the viaduct subject to certain technical specifications, but again, United Utilities are happy to work with the developers on that. Effectively, we chose to show the presence across W9, partly to, as I say, obviously to recognise United Utilities' concerns, and also just to acknowledge that because that's an area that is subject to a no build or the easement that will prohibit the building of houses, that we would show it as a potential greenway, which I'm sure has been incorporated into the detailed design work from Redrow on that site.
Okay, Mr. Gilbert.
So we agree with Mr. Crossley's assessment of the site in terms of the need to show it on an allocation on the local plan map. We're neither here nor there really. I think we know we can deal with the requirement within the site. So I don't think it matters either way to us, sir.
Okay, thank you. Great. Is there any other sort of physical or constraints that anyone wishes to raise? Obviously, we've touched on a number already, but does any of the developers or any of the participants want to raise any other constraints that people want to raise at this stage? Okay, fine. Thank you very much. I'm just going to move on to just our question really regarding the policy-wide policies and the need for specific site criteria, policy requirements. I think our question really was whether, in relation to each of the sites, whether whether the actual how do the council intend to bring these sites forward, and what are the mechanisms for a comprehensive and coordinated approach, and really is the approach of relying upon the plan-wide policies effective, or are more site-specific criteria or development principles required to guide the developments? If we could just get the council's view on that, obviously, please.
Yes, thank you, sir. Again, I think the council is content that the approach is suitable. Whilst there are, a grouping of sites in close proximity, they are clearly individual standalone sites. They don't form part of the same development. We think the only need for a coordinated approach is on the potential highways impact. And I think we have put in place the mechanisms in order to secure that. But each of the sites can be developed individually as a standalone parcel without impacting on the deliverability of the adjacent sites. So we don't think that there's a particular need or benefit for standalone policies for each of the sites. Also, given the scale of the sites, as each, I think the largest is about 480. Again, they seem to be below what would be reasonable, because a site of under 500 units would be expected to build out within 10 years. So we're not looking at sites that are going to be very much multi-phase and take a number of decades to complete. So we think the approach is suitable.
Okay. Mr. Gilbert, could I just ask your points really in relation to W9 then, please, just in relation to this question?
Yes, sir. So was there a specific point there?
Yeah, it's whether you're happy with the approach of basically, obviously the approach of relying on the plan-wide policies. Are they effective, or do you think that a more specific site criteria or development principles would benefit by guiding the developments?
Sorry, sir. Yeah, in terms of our site, no. I think we are one of the largest sites, and the delivery of these sites should be fairly straightforward. They're quite usual sites other than the viaduct we spoke about earlier, which on that's if the viaduct is to be mapped. I've got a note here that the standoff for that is 6 meters in total rather than 6 meters in each side. But no, sir, we don't have any. We're happy with our compliance with the policies as a whole. The only sort of note I have on that is we do, in part 3 of this examination, raise issues in terms of the open space and play space requirements for our site. Not that we fear we have a difficulty in meeting them, which is we have a difficulty in defining what those would be with the lack of document that Mr. Cross spoke about earlier. That's sort of my only caveat to that point, sir.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Coxon, just in relation to W11, if you could just cover that, please. Just whether you're... Sorry, you seem to be muted for some reason. Yeah, no, sorry, I can't hear you. Oh, yeah. If you could just move, Mr. Coxon. I think I can hear you now.
Hear me now, sir?
Yes, I can hear you now. Yeah, technical issue, but yes, if you just want to just
I can't quite hear you at the moment.
Please, thank you.
Yeah, apologies for that, sir. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can. Thank you. Yeah, just in relation to the same question, really. If you could just pick up on the approach of you know, whether the plan-wide policies are effective, or do you think site-specific criteria, development principles would benefit in terms of the site at W11?
No, I agree with the response of the council, sir. I don't consider I think the approach taken is adequate. I don't consider there's a need for any additional specific policies. There's nothing on our site on site W11 which wouldn't be picked up through those plan-wide policies. I've referred in my statement to some of the policies that would apply, and I cannot see any need to duplicate those.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Cox. And Mr. Saunders, in relation to W49, please.
Thank you, sir. Forgive me, I was just trying to find the reference, but I believe the council require the sites to be brought forward in detailed applications, full planning applications, which obviously, noting the size of some of these sites, you would sometimes find more of a hybrid scheme being brought forward. I think for our purposes, we're in single ownership. Miller have already done significant work on their preferred layouts in conjunction with the emerging plan policies. So we will be doing that, but I think it was more just an observation. I feel that is a safeguard, if you like, for the council to control the quality development, because they're not seemingly promoting the use of anything other than detailed planning applications. And the second point is, I think I've mentioned it earlier, I don't believe there's anything else more site-specific that we require enforcing on our site. We're happy for reference to be made to the brook that runs through and bisects the site. Like you say, we're using that to the benefit of our scheme as well. Thanks, sir.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other contributions on this particular question of the policy-wide versus site-specific criteria? Okay, are there any modifications that need to be made aware of, necessarily either to the policy or site allocations? Council?
No, don't think so, sir.
Okay, any of the developers? No. Okay. I'm just going to move on to the question of viability and deliverability. I just want to deal with the question of viability first, and then if obviously Ms. Malloy talked about the detailed table that we want the council to sort of set out for us in terms of the deliverability of each of the sites from the council's perspective, and then also the developer's perspective. But let's just deal with the question of viability in relation to each site. If we could just ask the question of the council in relation to basically the sites, whether they consider the proposed developments are viable, and then I could just move on to the developer's view. We should just start with W9 again.
Yes, sir, we do. Obviously, the sites were dealt with or considered in the whole plan viability study, and that concluded that the sites are deliverable and viable.
Okay, all right. Any questions in relation to the developers, please, just in terms of their view on the viability issue? Again, if we could just go to Mr. Gilbert first on W9 and W11.
Thank you, sir. No, nothing that we haven't already raised in relation to matter 5 and matter 11. So,
okay. Thank you, Mr. Coxon.
No, thank you, sir. Only to reiterate my point earlier that my client has undertaken internal financial appraisal, considers the site to be viable, and there is room within that if, for example, contributions to infrastructure such as education is required. So we consider the sites to be viable.
Okay, and Mr. Saunders, just in relation to W49.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Nothing further to add from our point of view.
Okay, yeah. So just in relation to the viability question, obviously the plan-wide, just to Mr. Cross really, the plan-wide viability obviously raised some issues in terms of the overall tests based in relation to the strategic allocations being marginally viable. But is it a case in this particular instance that the individual parcel of land coming forward would provide a higher level of viability? I just wanted to raise that question, just because the plan-wide viability did indicate for the strategic sites such as North East Widnes that they flagged as some marginal viability issues.
Again, sir, I think given the size, there will be some additional, just the additional infrastructure requirements in terms of internal roads and provision of open space. But I say the viability study did recommend the lower requirements for affordable housing and concluded that the sites are deliverable. We're not aware that any of the sites are subject to any particularly abnormal development costs that would impact on that, and I don't think you've had any evidence today to suggest that there are. So we are content that the sites are viable at the rate contained within the plan.
Okay, Mr. Harper.
It's Colleen again. I'm just wondering whether, with regard to viability and financial success of these sites, would they be considered as successful if the council were to insist, please God, that all of the internal road systems will easily allow 2 cars to pass one another, and that there is a pavement for people to be able to walk along to access their own homes?
Okay, Mr. Cross, do you want to just cover that point, please, or somebody from the council?
I'm sure the sites will be brought forward in accordance with the council's highway requirements. If Mr. Peake or Mr. Plant want to provide some additional detail, then I'm sure they can be happy to jump in.
Yes, so I can speak from the highway authority side of it. Roads that get to adoption, which, given the scale of these developments, I'm sure the developer would be keen to get the roads into the adopted status. Footways are always provided, and we accommodate sensible widths in terms of the number of dwellings accessed off a particular roadway.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Mrs. Harper, yeah.
I'm sorry, that's just not true. And I can tell you, over the last couple of weeks when I've been delivering leaflets, I've had to take my life on the hand several times when there are lots of estates in Widnes where there is not a pavement down one side of the road all the way down. And when we've tried to drive to them, it's been very difficult if a vehicle has been, particularly a delivery vehicle, has been coming the other way.
Is it in relation to new development or existing development? What's your reference to?
The thing is that the evidence that was just provided by Mr. Peake is that there hasn't been a problem with regard to this. But I'm saying, yes, there is. So please don't replicate it when you allow all these new sites to go through.
Okay. Yeah, so you're relating, obviously, in terms of the actual developments coming forward, in terms of the highway standards that need to be achieved.
if the better standards were applied than have been in the past, whether the developers would still consider the sites to be as viable.
Okay. Any other points, Mr. Coxon?
Thank you, sir. It's just a very brief point of clarification. In the council's hearing statement under the question of viability, question 12B9. I don't think you need to take you to it, sir, but it's just to point out that I think there's just an error. It says in reference to the developers associated with site W11, it refers to Liberty Properties, but clearly the interested parties are my client, Holland Strategic Land, who's a land promoter and a developer, and obviously Mr. Gilbert's client, Redrow.
Okay, thanks. Great. I think Mr. Peake wanted to raise.
Yes, so just a point of clarification to follow up, obviously, the residents and the representative from the area. We do adhere to manual streets in terms of our adoption processes and the way we design. Well, we approve design of developments. As I say, I can assure the complainant that we do specify footways to both sides of adoptable carriageways where there are premises. Service verges are slightly different. If it's an open space, that's managed either by the authority or by a third party. So that is where we allow grass verges these days. It is something that has been brought to the attention over the years, and as I say, all current developments and development going forward, there is specific criteria about road width and footway provision for adoptable roadways.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Peake. Okay, I'm just going to move on to the question of the developability of the actual site. And I think what I'm going to do is go through a series of the headings based in relation to each of the sites. I think we've basically asked the council to set up, as we discussed at the very outset, a basis of the meeting. Obviously, what we're trying to ensure that we have a table that's similar to is basically Appendix C of the 2017 SHLA, but with additional information, really, that obviously gives us an output in terms of individual years post the 5 years at the end of the period. So rather than groupings together. So and obviously, if you could a parallel schedule being developed for the developers, just in case there's any sort of areas where there may not be alignment in terms of the individual site. So I'm just going to go through and if as we asked at the outset, the council just to collect the information for it. So obviously, if we just start with site W9, obviously I think obviously name and the address of site. We've touched on the ownership detailed land ownership details. I think obviously the submission from the council obviously mentions Redrow's and obviously Mr. Gilbert's. Is there any other ownership issues that need to be raised in that particular?
No, there are no other ownership issues, sir.
No. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Ownership details. So just in terms of our next question, really, in relation to the timescales for marketing of the site and completion of contracts with house builders, and if necessary, any evidence to support that. Again, if the council and then maybe Mr. Gilbert wishes to raise how this has been dealt with, timescales for marketing and sites and completion contracts. Yeah, do you, Mr. Cross?
Obviously, in terms of the SHLA, we apply some standard assumptions depending upon the planning status where it is in the planning process. So where a site doesn't have consent, or where a large site doesn't have the benefit of planning consent, we assume a lead-in time of 8 years. And then on the larger sites, we assume an average build rate of 50 units per annum. But obviously, whenever we do the SLA, we do try to make contact with the developers or the landowners to try and see what their particular intentions are. So we're stood poised, pens that are ready to take down the more up-to-date details.
Okay, so for just Mr. Gilbert, what the information would be useful for us to know in relation to W9 was obviously the timescales for marketing and the site and completion contracts with the house builders, time for submission of the planning application, the timescales for that, any section 106 requirements and timescales for negotiating those, and then the timescales for basic site preparation work, including relocation of existing uses, etc. And then that hopefully should lead up to basically the start date. So give us some further information on those. Ask.
Yes, sir. We broadly not sought to challenge any of the SRL conclusions in any of the other sessions. We would work, and this would be dependent on the adoption of the local plan and timescales. That we don't. There's no real need for an allowance for marketing and sort of tying up a site contract. Redrow have got the interest in the site. We'd be looking forward to bring forward a planning application immediately on the allocation of the site, if that's what happens. We have broadly looked at a start on site at January 2023, with all those matters taken into account. So, and that would be allowing for the planning application, Section 106, and discharge conditions. We'd work on the basis of a 6-month sort of site setup period, and then beyond that would be delivering. 8-month site setup, and that would be looking at opening up then 2 outlets, which would broadly deliver 80 dwellings per hectare, dwellings per annum, sir.
So, sorry, could you just repeat that last bit, obviously, in terms of your build-out rates again?
Yeah, so on site W9, that would have we'd have 2 outlets there, and that would be expected to deliver 80 dwellings per annum, and that would be starting in August, September 2023.
So just in terms of where you see the timescales for completion, then basically based on a build rate of 80 dwellings, just if you could just give me that timescales for completion, including.
I'll have to get my calculator out, sir. It's from the midway through 2023, it would be 80 dwellings per annum until completion.
Right.
I haven't got a calculator open, but
we can come back to it. That's fine. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. And is there any other comments you want to make in respect of delivery of the site itself?
In terms of Redrow's ability to do it in confidence in those figures, that's been demonstrated by their delivery of development immediately sort of to the south of this area. So we're quite confident and comfortable with those timeframes. So if it helps, expecting moving on to W11 next.
Please, yes. Yeah.
Those are broadly the same timescales and same certainty on delivery of the site, albeit we'd expect that to take 6 months to set up from January 2023. And our capacity on that site is only 50 units, so we'd expect those to be delivered within a year. But that'll be alongside any comments that Mr. Coxon makes.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Coxon, just in relation to W11, yeah, I think you confirmed the issues relating ownership. Can you just confirm those again for me? Just all the landowners' interest again.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So my client, Holland Strategic Land, has an option over the parcels 167 and 169.
Okay.
And they're the parcels that are referred to in the appendices to the council's Matter 12 statement. Hollins is a strategic land promoter, but it is also a developer. I think in terms of delivery in the background, in fact, to all of what you've heard today, is that we've been in discussions with the council and the council have been obtaining information to inform these allocations over a prolonged period of time. We have made our intentions to the council clear that we're very keen to submit a planning application as soon as possible. Ideally, we'd like to submit a planning application so it's ready to be determined when the plan is adopted. We'd like to submit that application before the plan is adopted. So those are my client's intentions. It's anticipated that that planning application would either be outline or potentially hybrid, because, as I say, Hollands is a developer and would like to develop part of the site. So I think in terms of overall timescales, we would anticipate a similar start date to the one that Mr. Gilbert set out, which is in 2023. Expect first completions, so in a couple of years, possibly slightly later for the second developer phase, because they would obviously have to come in marketing, disposal and reserve matters. But certainly there's no reason why this site can't deliver and contribute to the 5-year housing land supply and achieve completion significantly quicker than the SLA rates that are set out in the council statement.
Okay, and what do you anticipate the build-out rates would be for your parcel, just to be clear, please?
Yeah, I think similar to what Mr. Gilbert set out. I think around 40 per outlet is reasonable.
Okay. And is there any other issues you want? And again, that's just the similar question, isn't it? Build out time, 40 per dwellings per hectare, and then basically, obviously, in terms of any other comments in terms of delivery.
No, as I say, other than my client has undertaken development appraisal, internal financial appraisal, and a range of technical assessments. And as I say, we've been in discussion with the council for some time in terms of basically how quickly we can bring this site forward. My client is raring to go, as it were.
Okay, could I just go back to the council, actually? We'll deal with W11, their comments in relation to W11, then we can go back to W10 as well. So we've just W11, really, what their views are in terms of timescales, please, start dates, build-out rates.
Yes, they seem basically as expected. I say obviously they have been in discussion with the landowners and the developers over a number of years now, and I say we were aware of the intention that planning applications would either come in shortly before adoption or shortly thereafter, with the intention of getting on site shortly, quite soon after that. As I say, the SLA with the 8 years is, it is possibly slightly on the side of caution. In terms of the build rates, I say obviously entirely in line with the assumptions in the SLA. It assumes on average for large sites 50 dwellings per annum. So having 2 outlets at each at 40 to deliver 80 units per annum is entirely consistent. If my arithmetic's right, that's just shy of a 6-year build out period for that site. For the other site, if it's the build out at I say at 40 would be sort of 7 years, but if there's 2 outlets, then that would potentially shorten the build out. So I think it's quite clear that the sites will be completely developed within the planned period. There's no risk of these sites extending beyond the proposed plan period.
Okay, can I just go back to W10? Sorry, just to be absolutely pedantic, in terms of just so I could just cover the information really in terms of what your views are in terms of, obviously you've mentioned there's no, in terms of landowner, you've mentioned in your submission, obviously no developer known at this time, but landowner interest, is that right?
As I say, the landowner has, as Mr. Plant intimated, has submitted a couple of planning applications for development of the site in the past, which have obviously been refused on greenbelt grounds. I don't think we've had any particularly recent contact with them in terms of bringing the site forward. But we would note it's a comparatively small site. It's a notional capacity of about 39. I'm sure, given the attraction of the adjacent sites to the market, this will be an attractive site, and so we don't see any impediment to the site coming forward during the plan period. Again, the SLA will make a notional assumption, I think, because of this, given the size of the site, assumes about a 7-year lead-in. But again, we're sure that the site can be delivered within the plan period.
And anticipated start date and build-out rate, please, just to be clear.
Given the size of the site at 39 dwellings, I think the SLA has the notional, from memory, is it 40 dwellings per hectare on sites of that size? It was covered in our matter paper 17, I believe, in terms of the standard assumptions, which I think is maybe a little bit previously a little bit on the high side for the smaller sites, but not ridiculously so.
And have you any evidence in terms of start date for this site? Would it be within the first 5 years? And have you got any evidence to show when it might be?
As I say, the assumption on sites of this size without the benefit of planning consent, we would assume 7 years with the minimum lead-in time. So we wouldn't assume it would generate units for a minimum of 7 years. So it will not count towards a 5-year supply.
Okay, so if we could just move on to W40, which is the obviously the site, Watkinson Way, please. Again, I think your information. Obviously, there's a resolution to approve on this site. Can I just in terms of landowner or developer, house builders on that site, would you be able to give me the information on that?
Perhaps Mr. Plant may be able to assist.
So, in fact, I was speaking to a developer only last week who has been approached by the landowner to take the site forward. So, discussions are already ongoing in terms of that moving forward from the outline position, even though that's not yet been granted.
Okay, so it's an outline application, obviously, on that site, yeah?
Yeah, that's correct, sir.
Okay, yeah, okay. And just the timescales again for that site for basic start and evidence of build-out rates, please, from those discussions.
In terms of starts on site, like I say, the developer is in early discussions with them. It's a registered provider who own the existing houses to the north. So I would expect those to come forward within the next few years. In terms of build-out rates, I think, Mr. Grant.
Again, the assumptions in the SLA for sites, a small sites less than 50 units with outline consent, we assume that there's a lead-in time of 1.5 years, and we assume that it would be 20 dwellings per annum. However, obviously, if the site is brought forward by an RSL or registered provider, the build rates, those assumptions sort of go out the window because they tend to build, if they've got to build them very, very quickly. So we probably see that site built out within a single year.
Okay, and just to be clear, within the next 5 years, within the 5-year land supply?
The assumption would be yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay, if we could just move on to, is there any other deliverability questions in relation to W40 that we need to raise at this stage, Mr. Cross, that we haven't raised already?
Not that I'm aware of, sir.
Okay. Can we just move on to W49 then, please? Again, landowner, obviously we've got Miller Homes, obviously, I think Mr. Saunders. So if just get the council just to get their views first, and then if Mr. Saunders could just come in on the developers' views in terms of anticipated timescales for for an application start rates, build out rates, please? Okay, Mr. Cross first, if could.
Again, standard assumptions would be the site doesn't have the benefit of planning consent, so we'd be looking at a lead-in of 8 years, and given the size of the site, build out rate at 50 units per annum.
Okay. Okay, and the start date, you said it was
8 years, so that would take us to 2029.
Right. Okay, so not within the first 5 years. No. Okay, Mr. Saunders, your view, please.
Yeah, there's probably quite a few parallels between what you've already heard from Mr. Gilbert and Mr. Coxon. Obviously, depending on when the local plan is adopted, but we'd be looking to submit a planning application shortly thereafter. Only delay really would be for consultation purposes. So we'd be seeing 2022 just to resolve planning matters, let's say, on a planning application, with a view to preliminary works and start on site in 2023. Our client has advised us that they'd look to sell from dual outlets. So, but our rates are approximately, on average, 50 per annum between the outlets, not at 80. Just on, I guess, some associated matters, I can confirm our clients control the allocation site on their own without impediment, and they have completed development not too far away from here as well, so they're quite confident of the local market and what they're doing.
Okay, so your view is that obviously, again, similar as to Mr. Coxon and Mr. Gilbert, that you'd be submitting, upon, if allocated, the site to submit an application with a view to start date. Just could we clarify that? Is it a similar timescale within the 5-year period? So could you just confirm what that might be, just so I'm clear from your perspective?
The start date, sorry.
Yeah, the start date, yes, please.
Yeah, we'll be looking to start on site in 2023.
Okay. Right. Okay. I've got nothing further to raise at this stage on delivery and viability in relation to the actual sites. Has anybody got anything else to raise at this stage in terms of that information? Obviously, if obviously the council collate the information that we've discussed, and obviously we'll do a similar process when we look at the sites.
Just sorry, Mr. Troy, just to clarify, where sites were predicted to start at 2023, would that be a full year sort of output of 40 or 50 dwellings per annum, or would it be a sort of a smaller amount in the first year? If people could just clarify that, please, from the developer's perspective.
Yeah, if you just start then with, Mrs. Saunders, obviously we spoke to you last, so maybe W49, what your view is in relation to that.
Yeah, well, we'd like to be as clear as we can, but we're obviously mindful of not knowing the resolution of the local plan process, and then how long our detailed planning application would take. But we would like to be first half of 2023, and on that basis, obviously, you can then pro rata that, but there also a likelihood is it may be to the back end of 2023. So I can provide further clarification if it helps, but I think it's difficult at this point without knowing the starting point.
I appreciate we don't have the benefit of a crystal ball, but it's just really so that the council can have an attempt at populating the schedule. So it's sort of best estimate really at this point.
Okay. For my purposes, I'd be happy if they want to just pro-rata a percentage of that 50 per annum for 2023 onwards, and then what it would be.
Sorry. Sorry for interjecting. If it is, to say again, in the SLA, they would say the lead-in assumptions, we sort of deal a little bit with the number of completions in year one. in terms of the lead-in time. So a number of the assumptions assume a 1.5 year lead-in time. So we tend to assume 50% output in year one on those sites. In terms of the information that I say we've just jotted down, there was a couple of sites that we did say August, September, so I would have proposed to take 50% output on those sites for year one. One of the sites did say mid-2023, so I would probably have assumed that year one would have been a full year's output, so I would probably have assumed 40 dPA for year one on that site. But to say if that's not the developer's understanding, we're happy to jot down the details and amend.
Yeah.
Thank you. Is that approach that Mr. Cross has outlined there, is that acceptable to the developers in question?
Yeah, we're okay with that, Mark.
Thank you.
I think so, Ma'am. From my perspective, all I would add, if it assists your deliberations for future hearings, is I think the council have been extremely busy over the last few months, obviously preparing for these hearings. But something I have raised with Mr. Cross is, if the council wishes for us to prepare a statement of common ground specifically on delivery, then my client is more than happy to enter into such an agreement if that's of benefit to you and the council.
Well, thank you for that offer. I don't want to add to the council's burden in terms of work, but obviously the intention was to try and agree the output in today's session. But obviously, if the council wanted to discuss that with yourself in terms of the output, to agree that table, and that's something that could take part outside the hearing sessions if the council had any queries or wanted to come back to you on.
Yeah, sorry, ma'am. Yeah, I didn't mean to add to the burdens. I suppose then to clarify, I am happy with what we've discussed today, and I think a partial contribution from our side from the first year, from 2023, which I think is what Mr. Cross suggested based on the timescales I put forward, is probably a reasonable approach and a sensible one, a sensibly cautious approach to delivery. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Mum, for ours, for Red Rose sites, half during the monitoring year of 2023-24, I would have half the delivery rate that we set, and then from the next monitoring year on, the full rate that we set out.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Harper. You wanted just to raise a point?
Yes, please. Listening to these the developers talk, a lot of them seem to want to start right at the same time. This land is of a piece, you might say. It's all in the same area. Would the council not place any restriction on the amount of building that was going on all at the same time, because of the impact that will have on the current residents? And how will they decide who, if they can't all go together at the same time, how will they decide who can go first?
Mr. Cross, have you got any comments at this stage? At that particular point, I know it's difficult to, obviously, this is really give us a best guess estimate, really, the overall view, but it is very much, we understand an estimate, really, for it at this stage.
The plan doesn't contain a phasing policy, so the council isn't proposing to phase the release of individual sites.
Okay. Okay, and really just to share the view that obviously the discussion of the delivery of individual developments doesn't prejudice our views as inspectors, basically when we're looking obviously at the overalls, the allocations and the plan itself. It's just really to give us an absolute view basically in terms of our consideration of the housing delivery of these particular sites and whether they're likely to be deliverable. It's just really a mechanism to get us to understand how that would sort of mesh together, and also how those sort of other factors which we've discussed today would sort of feature. So I haven't got anything further to raise at this particular point on SLR 7 in terms of the sites. Basically, I was intending to have a break probably till 2 o'clock. Then we'd move on to the safeguarded land at SG12. So unless anybody else has got anything further to raise at this stage, I'm going to adjourn until 2 o'clock. Thank you. Okay, we shall see you then, 2 o'clock. Thank you. Bye-bye.